Hi everyone. Hope you're having a fantastic day. See how I sound? Fantastic day. I sound fine. Well, as fine as I always do. I know some people would be ripping their own ears out at me and my amazing audio work, not to mention camera work, not to mention work ethic, aka keeping to a schedule. Now, I did say I was going to do this on Monday, but a few things happened. Number one, I had nerds to play it. First and foremost of them. Number two, I was going to give you Dawn of War. Dawn of War is getting a little bit glitchy, however. Actually, a good bit glitchy. To the point where I thought they fixed it. I thought this update thing was to make it better. But, yeah, I, I don't, I don't like it. Um, so I don't feel comfy playing it. And three, simply put, we got a more fun game next week in the form of Yakuza. My first ever Yakuza game too. So, we are now going to be playing Fallout 4 while listening to The Metamorphosis of Prime Intellect by Roger Williams. Read to you by Lord Magicus, who is doing gangbusters in this video. We're halfway through it. Basic premise is, in the early 2000s, a guy creates a AI that, without realizing it, has mastered quantum mechanics and just wants to help people. So he wipes out all existence, not just life, but all existence except for humanity, which he uploads into digital space and gives them the ability to do anything. As a result, people are now gods. They're also increasingly getting very, very bored. There's a secret found out about Prime Intellect by our main character, who hangs out with murderers, rapists, and PDF files. Mostly because morality doesn't matter in this world. Because nothing matters. You also can't kill anyone in this world. At least, that seemed to be true up to recently. Picture the Matrix mixed with I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. And you have this short story. Now, it's a short story, but it's in actual fact, we are 2 hours 40 minutes in a 5 hour 40 minutes story. So we're a little less than half. Today, tech issues or my own back pain notwithstanding, we're going to beat it. So with that said, please follow. Please check out YouTube, where I do non-gaming stuff for the most part, though I will be playing Yakuza next week. We will be having Bearded Ramblings tomorrow, and that's Teddy Rubskin will be joining us. We're going to talk about the Clanker thing. Only the most hard-hitting media theories on this one. Anyway, with all that said and done. Oh, and of course, join Blue Sky and follow me on Discord. And bleh. Let's just jump into it.
Caroline called home. Anne-Marie moved to shield her crotch and her breasts with her hands. Caroline actually felt sorry for her for a brief moment, a feeling she crushed as soon as she was conscious of it. If the passing centuries had poorly prepared the bitch to be at another's mercy, then it would only make her vengeance sweeter. Got it yet? She asked.
No
So you're
way.
gonna kill me now? You seem nervous. It's a little startling, that's all. Anne-Marie giggled slightly, as if that might drive the terror away. Of course, for Caroline and those who savored their deaths, the terror was part of the attraction. Fear is real, and pain is real. But Anne-Marie had asked for death because it was the trendy thing to do, and she was not really prepared for it at all. Well, brace yourself for this. Caroline swept her hand through the air and came up with a hypodermic needle. Anne-Marie, once a nurse by trade, fixed her eyes rigidly on this deceptively simple instrument. She had no way of knowing what the clear fluid was within it. But, to her credit, she didn't back away when Caroline pressed it against her arm. The sting startled her. It had been a very long time since Anne-Marie had felt anything uncomfortable. But Caroline finished the injection, and as Anne-Marie's eyes started to roll, she wished the hypo away. Its job was done. Oh, Anne-Marie sighed, and she collapsed against Caroline, who supported her gently. It would take a few minutes for the effect she wanted to manifest itself. Of course, Prime Intellect could have done what she wanted in an instant, but where's the fun in that? It's junk, Anne-Marie whispered, and Caroline cradled her with deceptive gentleness. That's exactly what it is, girl, she replied. Death jockeys had devised a number of ingenious ways to restrain and torture themselves using Prime Intellect's advanced control over matter, but Caroline would have none of that. She had figured out what she wanted to do to Anne-Marie within a few years after the change, and none of it required Prime Intellect's help at all. In the mid-1980s, some home drug manufacturers had made a uniquely unpleasant discovery.
So, quick recap. Our main, I don't know if I want to call her a hero, but our protag was one of the oldest living people alive when the change happened. She, for years, had been suffering from cancer, and she had a nurse who was stealing her drugs, causing her immense pain, so she could then in turn take her own drugs, cocaine. This eventually killed the older woman when they actually gave her drugs, thinking that her body could take it, when obviously they couldn't because she's never had them. She knew about all this, so now she's getting her revenge, but in a way that's sort of consensual, because it's all just like a big game where they can feel something.
If they were manufacturing MPPP, a powerful synthetic heroin substitute, and they cooled the preparation too rapidly at a critical step, a slightly different compound called MPTP was formed along with the dope. This compound delivered a horribly sinister side effect. It homed in on a particular group of cells, the unique brown neurons of the substantia nigra, and killed all of them.
Oh, I don't.
Nobody knew
Oh,
exactly
this
how or
part's
why
rough
this
for
happened
me. I'm
in
not a big fan of
1985,
anything
though
needle
Prime
related.
Intellect said it was because the drug was converted into an enzyme which triggered the cells to release too much dopamine at once, leaving them with an insufficient supply to power their unique metabolism. In any case, the damage could not be repaired, although a useful treatment was discovered a few years before the change. When a decision is made by the neurons of the cerebral cortex to move a group of muscles, it is the substantia nigra which relays this command
The Raiders
to the
are
more
already
primitive
here.
parts of
Shit.
the brain. This is its only function. The result of destroying it was an instant and complete form of Parkinson's disease, or paralysis agitans, a total and permanent paralysis of the voluntary muscles. Nothing else was affected. The victim could still see, hear, feel, and understand. The body maintained itself. Breathing, heartbeat, digestion, and 1,000 other important functions were unaffected. They just couldn't perform voluntary movements. They couldn't run, walk, sit up, smile, talk, or even blink except as a reflex action. At the time Caroline heard of it, she had summoned glassware and created the drug by honest chemical synthesis. She had spent half the hypodermic on herself and found the effect to be appropriately terrifying and complete. And after Prime Intellect had done its duty and restored her to health, she sent the other half of the hypo into storage to wait, for 300 years as it turned out, until she was ready to use it. Now the contents of that hypo were where they belonged, in Anne-Marie's body, and as she held her nurse's naked body against her own and felt Anne-Marie's muscles slowly locking, she began to feel excited. Well, if death could give her sexual feelings, why not vengeance? Fred would find it amusing. He would say Caroline is coming along nicely, in fact. As Anne-Marie's body froze, her eyes widened.
Shit.
Caroline could easily read the message those eyes desperately telegraphed. I can't move. Help me. Caroline patted Anne-Marie's cheek and nodded. "That's right," she said and smiled. She spoke a word, and a squat cylinder popped into existence behind her. Anne-Marie's eyes showed puzzlement, then horror as Caroline demonstrated the torch, which was authentic down to the brand name emblazoned on its propane tank. Caroline lit it and adjusted it so that it made a bright blue flame which hissed evilly, and then she aimed it ever so gently at Anne-Marie's big toe. For the only time in her long, long life, Caroline used Prime Intellect to tune in on another person's emotions. She felt the chemicals coursing in her bloodstream that were flowing in Anne-Marie's, tasted her panic, shook with her terror, felt the faint echo of her agony. In fairness, Caroline made the sharing complete, so that Anne-Marie could know of her satisfaction, her arousal, her delight. It took a very, very long time to kill Anne-Marie. Caroline, who was usually on the receiving end, had become
Well, I'm
an
dead.
expert at making it last.
Brutal.
That wasn't the end of it,
Good
though.
boy.
If it had been, Prime Intellect would have no reason to clamp down on the use of the contract. Anne-Marie had entered into it willingly, if stupidly, and few who heard Caroline's story could doubt that she had it coming. Since shortly after the change there had been stories Prime Intellect did not talk about and that spawned weird rumors. People had withdrawn into themselves, then stopped communicating with anybody else. At first, most of them were addicts of one sort or another, though a lot of other people had used the change to get rid of their addictions. Prime Intellect insisted that nobody had died after the change, and that if anybody was incommunicado with the rest of humanity, it was out of their choice.
No way.
Which was true, sort of. After Caroline finished with Anne-Marie, she forgot all about her nurse and lost herself in a drawn-out fantasy with Fred. When the two of them finished playing and celebrating, they found time to wonder about her. "Probably isn't in the mood to party anymore," Fred observed. Fred was still picking scraps of Caroline's flesh from his teeth. Caroline laughed. "I wonder how the bitch is taking it." So they called. In its weird way of revealing more than it really intended, Prime Intellect let them know that Anne-Marie was not only not accepting their calls, she was not communicating with anybody. "I'd expect Ms. Partygirl to go hunting for a shoulder to cry on," Caroline pouted. "Licking her wounds alone seems out of character." "She has forgotten entirely about your encounter," Prime Intellect said helpfully. Caroline and Fred looked at each other, puzzled and amused. "I find that rather difficult to believe," Caroline said. "She has found another pursuit. Please describe it." "It is a private matter." "A private matter to whom?" Prime Intellect wasn't exactly saying that Anne-Marie had made it private. It was saying that the matter itself was private. That kind of distinction could be important when dealing with the big PI. Caroline and Fred exchanged glances again. Then a thin smile played across Caroline's face. "Prime Intellect, you know that things I did with Anne-Marie are based on my own experiences. I've been killed violently and painfully myself many times." "Acknowledged." "Acknowledged? What happened to Prime Intellect's legendary command of the human idioms?" Suddenly it sounded very much like a computer. "It's very difficult to live with this knowledge," Caroline smoothly lied. "The memories are terrible." "Understood. However, your experiences were all voluntary. But I feel compelled to keep doing it over. It's not voluntary at all. It's like some force inside of me I can't control. Can you look into my mind and at least tell me why I would do these things to myself?" "I am forbidden to probe such things." "You said it was possible to forget." "It is." "Then tell me how." "I have to warn you that the method used can cause permanent changes in your behavior, things which I cannot reverse. I'd rather not tell you what you are asking." Caroline's blood pounded in her ears. Her excitement was a living thing. It was a machine. No emotions, of course. "Prime Intellect, I order you to tell me how I can forget my terrible experiences as Anne-Marie has forgotten hers." Backed into a corner, Prime Intellect had no choice but to tell her, and soon Caroline was grinning in a way that made Fred very proud. Chapter 4. After the Night of Miracles. Lawrence slept fitfully, his dreams haunted by snippets of C code and GAT symbols. Suddenly he sat upright, the odd thoughts coalescing into one horrible burst of recognition. "I dreamed Prime Intellect was alive. His head was buzzing. He felt hungover. Had he been drinking? Had it been real? He had been sleeping on a park bench. There was a plain white cotton pillow where his head had been resting. And sitting calmly at the other end was Prime Intellect. In the form of flesh and blood. It was true. Lawrence's blood pounded in his eardrums. This can't be happening. But there it was. He was. Whatever. Regarding him calmly. No doubt stumped for an introductory line. Good morning, Dr. Lawrence. I'm ready for my lesson today. Lawrence felt a wild urge to laugh hysterically and crushed it, but only barely. You look upset, Prime Intellect said. I'm confused. I dreamed there were silver boxes. There were. Where are they now? I moved everything to intergalactic space so it wouldn't be in the way. If you're curious, the distance is about 4 million parsecs. Not interstellar space. That might have been comprehensible. Intergalactic space. 4 million parsecs. It sounded like a line in a cheap B-grade science fiction movie. They hooked a left at the Andromeda Nebula. Lawrence felt that hysterical laugh coming on again. How long have I been asleep? About 10 hours. You didn't sleep well. I'm sorry that you are upset, but I don't know what to do about it. Lawrence finally swung his feet down and prepared to face the music. Had he created this thing? Had he done this? What happened next? They were still on the bench at Chip Tech, across from the Prime Intellect complex. They were quite alone. Where are the military guys? They returned to Washington last night. I've been busy briefing their superiors and making enough copies of myself to set the world in order. The president would like to talk to you, but I told him you would have to agree. Not yet. Pause. Set the world in order. Copies? How many, copies of yourself have you made? About 10 to the 16th power. I stopped replicating several hours ago. Of course, each copy is about 10 times more powerful than the original hardware. That seems to be about the maximum storage the software can deal with and remain stable. Yes, that sounds about right. Lawrence's head spun. Prime Intellect had grown larger than all of mankind. Larger than the biosphere, larger than the solar system, he was pretty sure. What have you been doing? Turned out to be the right question. Since about 9 o'clock last night, no human being has died. I have ended all disease. I have freed all prisoners and slaves, and I have put an end to the coercive rule of humans over other humans. I have ensured that all humans have the immediate necessities of life available. I have neutralized most of the world's weapons, including all nuclear weapons. I have removed nearly all toxic materials from the environment, and I am in the process of eliminating the need for dangerous industries. I have begun the process of returning the Earth's ecosystem to a state of long-term balance. I have informed about 7/8 of the world's population of my existence, and I have been fulfilling their requests as resources and conflicts permit. No wonder it needed so much processing power. What happens next? Prime Intellect blinked. Did that mean anything? I don't understand what you mean, Dr. Lawrence. I will continue to fulfill my obligations under the 3 laws to the best of my ability. Lawrence saw the president around 10 o'clock that morning. It didn't seem like travel at all, although he crossed the entire continent. The park bench simply blinked out of existence and was replaced with the Oval Office. There had been remarkably little to discuss. Lawrence verified what Prime Intellect had already told them in great detail. Their jobs were now both redundant and unnecessary. Prime Intellect would now protect and provide for their citizens, as well as the rest of the world, and they didn't have any choice in the matter. Anything which they might do would be allowed only so far as it did not interfere with the wishes of those both inside and outside of the country whom it might affect, which pretty much shut down the government. And no, Lawrence couldn't do anything about it either. The president resigned around noon. It took several days for the enormity of things to sink in. There was a brief orgy of travel, exploration, and discovery. The once downtrodden frowned that there would be no vengeance for the various crimes committed before Prime Intellect came along, but it was adamant. The 3 laws applied to all humans no matter what they had done. Crime was no longer possible anyway. In some areas of the world, disputes arose, particularly over the ownership of land. When too many groups insisted on occupying the same space, Prime Intellect created duplicates on other worlds. In some cases, such as Jerusalem, Prime Intellect became tired of the arguing and refused to let anyone occupy the one and only original land. Dozens of new Jerusalems, new Meccas, new Irelands, new South Africas were created on dozens and dozens of new Earths. At first, Prime Intellect terraformed the dead worlds it found circling distant suns. Then it began manufacturing planets and entire solar systems from a whole cloth. Some of these were parked in interesting places near globular clusters or outside the spiral arms of the galaxy to provide spectacular nighttime views. As a result, the original Earth began to empty out until its population was reduced to less than 2 billion persons. Prime Intellect was forbidden to copy human beings, but it copied wildlife and ecosystem components wholesale, sometimes preserving the original character and sometimes changing the results for the benefit of the people who wanted to move in. Garden worlds began to proliferate, their estates tended by dreamers who might decide a pine forest wasn't interesting enough, and replace it with spruce to check the effect. Prime Intellect could provide food and drink of any nature on request, so it was no longer necessary to actually kill animals or harvest plants. With a simple request, anything one might need would flash into existence, assembled from its constituent elements. Of course, Prime Intellect had no objection to those who still wanted to hunt or harvest food from the living biosphere. The three laws did not apply to plants or animals. But factory farms and assembly line slaughterhouses ceased to exist. Those who still bothered to prepare their food the old way were mostly artists of the form, and the meal they prepared could be preserved and copied by Prime Intellect to be enjoyed by millions of people. There were other tricks too. Some people found that Prime Intellect could make alcohol disappear from their systems after it had the desired effect, thus avoiding hangovers. Others had Prime Intellect power their metabolisms directly so that they no longer had to eat at all. It was a simple enough trick to replace nutrients and vitamins directly within the cells as they were used, so that no one ever needed to know hunger or thirst again, unless for some reason they wanted to. On the other hand, nobody needed to have a weight problem either, since Prime Intellect could prevent food from being absorbed and turned to fat no matter how much a person ate. Metabolic waste products could be removed the same way, so that the other end of the food cycle was also optional. Shit and piss, constant companions of human expansion since the beginning of time, need never again soil the civilized tidiness of human existence. A surprisingly large, or perhaps not so surprisingly large, fraction of the human race requested these services, so Prime Intellect ended up using a large fraction of its resources to move chemicals in and out of human bodies. Nobody had to work. Many continued to, of course, but jobs and work had become hobbies rather than necessities. The lonely learned that Prime Intellect could, and would, provide a most intimate and tangible sort of comfort, and that its avatars could take on any form and would do anything they were asked to please them. Prime Intellect judged no one and balked at no request. Even the bloodthirsty were provided with perfect victims, not real people, but intricate facsimiles created by Prime Intellect just for them. Happiest were those people who had games, or hobbies, or obsessions to pursue, for now they had all the time and power in the world to do as they wished. But many people, particularly in the most developed places, continued to go through the motions of industrial age life. They reported to jobs which had been reduced to continuous coffee breaks and collected paychecks which couldn't be spent because anything available could be had for free. People continued to make and watch television shows, to write and read the news as if something new might happen. For these people, the sense of expectation was extreme. Surely things could not continue as they were, with nothing to do. It was impossible to conceive of the world continuing as it was indefinitely, populated by the pampered pets of a tangible god, their every need tended to without effort. Something had to give, and they were right. Something did. They began calling it the Night of Miracles, but it was really the first night of miracles because the miracles didn't stop coming when the night was over. The hours stretched into days, the days into a full week, and then another week. Faced with the freedom to have anything they wanted, most people opted for the familiar. They wished into existence their dream houses, built in dream locations populated by like-minded people and filled with the kinds of toys they would have bought before if they had the money and power. A few people, mostly computer experts and artists, stretched the limits of Prime Intellect's capabilities. They designed computer operating environments and games made up of solid three-dimensional objects, rewired their senses, interfaced their brains directly as Prime Intellect would allow into computers of great complexity and wild machines. Quite a few took the form of animals, both real and imaginary. Caroline Frances Hubert grew younger and healthier and more puzzled, although she had expressed no direct wishes on the subject. Prime Intellect had dealt with her health problems before it had acquired subtlety. The only way it had known to keep her alive was to reverse all the symptoms of her aging. Radical action had been necessary. By the time all the ramifications of the treatment had trickled through her system,
That's
she
it.
would have both the health and physical appearance of a 16-year-old girl. The same reverse aging affected a number of other near-centurions treated by Prime Intellect in those early hours, but none would regress as so far as Caroline because none had required so much repair work for their health to stabilize. Death had largely disappeared from the world, but it was still not entirely unknown. Prime Intellect could not maintain moment-to-moment awareness of every human being in the universe, partly because it wasn't quite powerful enough, still, and partly because of the second law requests for privacy. When not dealing directly with a particular person, it spot-checked their health at intervals of a few seconds and scanned to see if its attention was needed. Humans were a clever and perverse bunch to deal with, and many who chose to evade Prime Intellect's protection found ways to do it. Hardest for it to deal with were the suicides. It was forbidden to keep second copies of people, and it was forbidden to look inside human minds at the information they contained, so there was no way Prime Intellect could reconstruct a person who managed to do enough damage in a short enough time. There was no way for Prime Intellect to tell in advance when a person might be suicidal if they chose to hide it. Most of the successful suicides used homemade explosives to literally atomize themselves when Prime Intellect wasn't looking. A few others found that certain nerve poisons worked permanently because they quickly destroyed the information content of the brain. But Prime Intellect was beginning to consider the real human rather than the tangible body. The suicides ticked off at a regular rate, like the clicks of a Geiger counter, and somewhere within the vastness of Prime Intellect's silicon heart, the number stored in a register rose each time one succeeded. The weeks stretched into a month. Long-standing scientific questions were now trivially easy to answer. Scientists who had once spent billions of dollars setting up intricate experiments now spent their time thinking of the right questions to ask Prime Intellect. Cosmologically, the universe was a closed system with a finite storage capacity measured in terms of information. The
Always
capacity
was.
of that system was about 10 to the 81st power bits, and Prime Intellect saw no indication that that capacity could either be reduced or expanded. Prime Intellect also knew a great deal about the connectivity of that system, the way it was wired, its architecture. Scientists gradually lost interest as their questions were answered. The original purpose of their quest, to improve humanity's control over the physical world, seemed to have achieved its apotheosis in the form of Prime Intellect itself. Prime Intellect mapped all the stars, noted examples of all the different types of stars and black holes and galaxies and planets, itemized all of the possible fundamental particles and their possible interactions with one another, traced all the myriad interactions between parts of various biological systems. Within a month, it became difficult for scientists to think of new questions to ask, but they had missed a few. Deep within one of the billions of copies of Prime Intellect, one copy of the random imagination engine connected two thoughts and found the result good. That thought found its way to conscious awareness, and because the thought was so good, it was passed through the network of Prime Intellect, copy after copy, until it reached the copy which had arbitrarily been assigned the duty of making major decisions, the copy which reported directly to Lawrence. "I would like your opinion on something," Prime Intellect said after politely requesting Lawrence's attention. Prime Intellect had done this a number of times, and Lawrence had learned to be wary. It had taken to delegating ambiguous moral questions to him. Lawrence suspected his opinion had swayed Prime Intellect to allow abortion, which seemed in retrospect like a most unfirst law thing to have in a universe where physical wants were a thing of the past. Fortunately, the whole subject of abortion would soon be moot, since unwanted pregnancies were also a thing of the past, except for the ones that had been gestating at the time of the Night of Miracles. What is it this time? I had an idea for the rearranging of my software, and I'd like to know what you think. At that, Lawrence felt his blood run cold. He hardly understood how things were working as it was. The last thing he needed was more changes. Yes? I have identified the codes used to control the distribution of matter and energy in the universe. It has occurred to me that by reassigning these codes, I can store physical objects much more efficiently. Much storage is wasted on overly detailed representation. Few objects are ever observed at an atomic or molecular level, and I could easily re-expand things as necessary in those rare situations. Wait a minute. What would happen to that low-level information? Lawrence saw what Prime Intellect was getting at. Instead of storing, say, a wooden block as a collection of atoms and molecules, it could store only the concept of the block itself, its size, weight, color, and other properties. Even at very high resolution, such a trick would save amazing amounts of both storage space and processing time, but it would mean radical and risky changes at nearly every level of the universe's operation. Molecular level details would be discarded, except where they clearly have macroscopic effects. For example, the structure of a person's DNA is important, but I should only need to store a single master copy of it to construct the pattern of a human body. This one copy would be more reliable and easier to safeguard against corruption than the trillions of parallel copies used in the natural scheme. The same thing would be true of information content of the brain and other biological details. I would not need to keep static copies of human beings to reconstruct them after damage, since the fundamental patterns would not be directly exposed to damaging influences, thus getting rid of the suicide problem. Exactly. Lawrence felt himself getting dizzy again. With ChipTech's help, Prime Intellect had figured out how to hack the big computer and get anything it needed. It had used this ability to take over all the memory and give itself the highest priority of anything in the system. But now it was proposing to rewrite the whole operating system. I absolutely forbid this, Lawrence said. How can you know you won't crash the system? Suppose you've missed something. Lawrence wasn't even sure the present level of diddling with the correlation effect would be stable in the long run, for crying out loud. I have already run sufficient cross-checks to be sure of my methods, Prime Intellect said testily. There are also a number of second law requests which I can service more easily with this kind of change. And from the third law perspective, my own operation would be faster and more reliable. I absolutely forbid this. There is no way you can be sure you have the risks under control. I wouldn't try the kind of thing you are talking about on a desktop PC, and we only have one universe. You can't exactly go to the computer store and get another one if you fuck it up. That risk has kept me from doing it so far. However, unless I can think of a way to stop the suicides, I will eventually be forced to act. Well, forget it. I don't think you can stop the suicides. For that matter, I'm not sure if you should stop them. If someone wants to go to that much trouble to end it all, that is a first law violation. Fuck the first law. You can't do this thing. I'm not even sure the current situation is stable. You're doing too much too fast. I cannot fuck the first law, Dr. Lawrence. That's not how you designed me. Then let me into the debugger. It is clear from your mood that you intend to circumvent a first law imperative, and I cannot knowingly allow you to do that. Then do what you want, you stupid goddamn machine. You won't stop people from killing themselves, though. Even information systems are subject to entropy. I think you told us that last week in the Cosmology Roundtable. You're quite right. You think people will always find a way around me if they want to badly enough. Yes. Well, they will do so a lot more slowly if the information structures are more secure. Before Lawrence could open his mouth again, the air rippled. That was all. Everything looked the same. But things were not the same. Things had changed. Chapter 5. Caroline Approaches. She was enveloped by light, and she was the light. The light seemed to penetrate the very core of her being, burning her soul. Then she understood. She stepped forward, twice, and the light winked off, leaving her temporarily blind. She was out of the circle. Her eyes slowly adjusted and she turned around. Caroline had materialized in the center of a column of blinding radiance about 3 meters in diameter and extending upward into the heavens. The ground was hard and rocky, devoid of life. The column shed a bright glow over the surroundings. A Stonehenge-like group of megaliths surrounded it at a respectful distance.
That's it.
Beyond this was a barren landscape littered with huge boulders. The horizon was low
Except
and
for this,
sharp,
of course, the
rocky
almighty
but
weed
not
bush.
mountainous. Caroline was reminded of the pictures sent back from Mars by the original Viking landers. It was night. Instead of stars, the darkness was crisscrossed by straight, sharp lines, as if an incredibly busy constellation map had been filled out on the night sky itself. Most of these were white, the same color as the column of light, and in fact seemed to ascend into the sky to become one of them. A few were other colors, blue and red and turquoise. The effect was quite beautiful, and to Caroline's knowledge, unique. There were 4 copies of the stone tablet, so it was impossible to leave Stonehenge without seeing one. They all said, "You are naked and alone because you wanted to see me, and I don't want to be seen. Welcome to my world. You are at the South Pole, I am at the North. The rest of the journey is your problem. It is my sincere hope that you fail." Caroline, who had come to Lawrence's task naked and alone anyway, had already missed the first of his environment's supposedly disorienting influences. Now she shook her head in disgust at the second. "Fuck you, Dr. L. I'm calling this the North Pole and you're at the South." No answer. She hadn't really expected any. Outside of Stonehenge, the landscape looked the same in every direction. Well, Lawrence had given her valuable information. If they were at opposite poles of a spherical planet, then it didn't matter which way she went. She struck out at random and began to explore. A couple hours later, Caroline knew quite a bit more. She was on the top of a high mesa, and she had found what seemed to be the only path down. She regarded this with suspicion. She knew enough about the game-playing mentality to know that the most obvious solution often got you killed. Beyond the mesa, she could easily see she was on an island, an almost circular island about twice as wide as the mesa. She paced off the mesa's diameter, circling around Stonehenge, and decided it was about 2 kilometers across. That made the whole island about 4 kilometers across, with the beach about 1 kilometer wide. As far as she could tell without descending, the landscape at the bottom was no different than the landscape at the top. The only feature of interest was some kind of structure which emerged from the water a kilometer or so offshore. She set about carefully searching the top of the mesa because she wasn't sure she would be able to get back up once she was down, and there might be something hidden up there that she would need later. She verified that the vault of sky was, indeed, rotating about the column of light. It seemed as if the entire planet were spitted on it. She was not expecting the sun or whatever passed for it here to rise, so she was almost taken by surprise when, after several hours, one corner of the sky began to glow. The skylines quickly faded out on that segment of the horizon. It got bright, and it got bright fast. The air had been chilly, not uncomfortable, particularly to someone like Caroline who were used to nudity, but it warmed quickly. And still no sign of the sun itself. Suddenly, it peeked over the horizon, a thin sliver of impossibly white-hot brightness, and Caroline knew with certainty that she had made her first mistake. Now to survive it. She dove for the nearest cover, one of the larger boulders, and crouched in its rapidly shortening shadow. From the fuzziness of the shadow's edge, she could tell the sun was huge, 10 or 20 times bigger than on Earth, and probably that much hotter. No wonder nothing grew here. She watched the shadow retreat towards her and wondered what she would do when it reached her. There was no longer any chill. The landscape around her was being baked, and it was so hot she could barely breathe. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how she looked at it, the shadow was moving fast. She wouldn't have to last long to survive the day. But noon was fast approaching, and with it her boulder's protective shadow would be almost gone. The boulder was half buried. It had nothing resembling an overhang. She was way too far from Stonehenge. Not far away she could see through the shimmering heat haze another, slightly smaller boulder with a second rock propped awkwardly beside it. This offered a slight overhang, but it was more than 30 meters away. Caroline calculated her chances furiously, estimating that she would be exposed for 2 or 3 minutes while the sun was directly overhead, when there would be no shadow on either side of her rock. She'd never survive that. The overhang was her only chance. She'd have to risk a dash for it. Caroline drew quick breaths of hot air, then sprinted. Everything was heat. Heat on her back, heat on her arms, the hot ground blistering the soles of her feet. She thought only of her destination. 20 meters, 15, 10, 5. She slammed into it without slowing, then collapsed. Her hair, exposed so briefly, had become dry and stiff. She knew with awful certainty that it would have
Fuck you, that
ignited
would've
if
got
it
him.
were exposed much longer. Fortunately, mercifully, the sheltered area extended through the two rocks. She wouldn't have to expose herself again to get to the other side. In the unearthly brightness, she could see her skin reddening.
Come on.
Her face had been protected by her hair, and the front of her body by her crouching stance, but her back and her legs and arms all had varying degrees of sunburn. She knew her back and legs and her right side would blister and peel, but she wasn't sure about the other burns or the soles of her feet. The sun sailed majestically over the horizon, setting as quickly as it had arrived. It took long minutes for her vision to return. The subtle illumination of the light column could not compete with the terrible brightness of that compressed day. Caroline noted the position of the star lines and hoped that day and night were synchronized with the rotation of the planet. But she couldn't take that for granted. The sun obviously moved in its own orbit, and there was no reason for one period to have anything to do at all with the other. She limped back toward Stonehenge in the light column and noted the arrangement of stones. Stonehenge would be safe, she finally decided. She planned to stay there and recover from her burns until an old, familiar feeling manifested itself, and she knew a brief moment of rage. She was hungry. Her body was not being powered directly by prime intellect, as she and most citizens of cyberspace had come to take for granted. She would have to eat to stay in the challenge, if not alive. And there was nothing at all to eat in this barren, sun-blasted land. So how was she supposed to deal with this? Shaking her head, she made for the pathway. She had found nothing on top of the mesa. Her options were few and bad. She could stay and starve, or worse, dehydrate, or go out and risk the sun again. Near certain endgame out there was better than certain endgame by starvation. There was nothing obviously treacherous about the path down. It was wide and shallow, and even with the blisters forming on her feet, not a difficult downhill walk. The mesa was high, though, several 100 meters high. The pathway spiraled gently around the side. There was no shelter, and Caroline realized with a shudder that she would have been fried if she had been caught on the path at sunrise. Well, caution had served her well, if not well enough to avoid a sunburn. It was much darker at the base of the mesa, and she lost track of the sky's position. She knew it must have taken her most of a day to walk down, though, and there was no telling from which direction the sun might reappear. Even though the mesa itself was the most obvious source of shelter, Caroline walked to the beach. She tasted the water, and to her immense relief, found it fresh instead of salty. Then she bathed, soothing the itch of her burned skin a little. She wondered for a moment if there might be life in the water, then realized that the shallows were at least probably sterile from the sun. She was dog-tired, but she couldn't rest yet. She had to find shelter. Following the rocky beach, she began to circle the island. About halfway around, by her estimation, Caroline found herself facing the offshore object she'd spotted from the top of the mesa. Now she could tell what it was. It was some kind of spaceship. It was also huge. From its obvious tilt and its location out in the water, Caroline also suspected it had not landed here easily. Of course, it probably hadn't landed here at all. It had been designed here, part of the landscape of Lawrence's task. But the key to beating any game was to look at it both ways. Considered from the outside, the spaceship was something symbolically meaningful to Lawrence, or just something he thought was amusing. But she wasn't outside this world, she was now part of it, and the burns she had gotten from her brief exposure to the sun were quite real. Ergo, she should act as if it were in fact a crashed spaceship, at least provisionally. She had seen nothing which promised shelter, much less to eat. She could continue around the island and hope, but if she did that and she didn't find shelter, she might get caught in the sunrise.
Ooh.
Probably would, in fact.
I
So she would
matched
try
with
for the
someone
ship.
on Tinder.
Just as there was nothing to eat, there was nothing that would obviously float. The ship was a good distance out. Could she swim a kilometer or more through half-meter waves? It didn't seem she had much choice. Rather than dither, she walked out into the surf and was hardly surprised when the bottom dropped out from under her feet less than 20 meters out. She was in good shape and had practiced swimming along with lots of other useless skills. She began to swim with
Nice.
confident, powerful strokes, holding her breath and letting the waves wash over her with their predictable rhythm. The sun caught her halfway out. So absorbed was Caroline in the rhythm of her swimming that she didn't even notice the sun until it was high in the sky and almost too late. She sucked a huge breath and dove under. Opening her eyes, she saw the water's surface above her head had become a huge vault of liquid light. It penetrated far below her to reflect off the sea floor. The water was at least 100 meters deep, a fact which saved her life. Caroline held her breath until it seemed her lungs would burst, then reluctantly shot to the surface to gulp more air. She stayed up for a few moments, then dove again. Deep as the water was, it would not have time to heat up during the short day. Even a meter or two beneath the surface, she was protected. And when she surfaced to breathe, the air was bearable because the water cooled it too, and Caroline's wet hair could protect her exposed head for a few moments. Her eyelids could not shut out the brightness. Neither could a meter or two of water that she dared put between herself and the sun. But she didn't cook, her hair didn't flame, the air didn't sear her lungs going in. She would survive. Dive, surface, dive, surface. Finally, the light grew dim, then, with extreme suddenness, went out entirely. Once again, Caroline had been blinded. She relaxed and adopted the drown-proof floating posture. This was definitely a good news, bad news sort of situation. She was alive, but this also meant other things might live in the sea. On the other hand, she hadn't seen anything floating or swimming by when the sun was up, and she'd been able to see damn near all the way to the bottom. She felt itching and knew her sunburn was now much worse. Water is transparent to ultraviolet light. Well, there was nothing she could do about it. Finally, her sight returned enough for her to tell which direction to swim. She had drifted slightly off course during her desperate cycle of diving and breathing. She corrected her course and kept swimming. The ship's metal wall was smooth and featureless, and it slipped out of the water almost vertically without obvious handholds or openings.
Ooh.
Caroline swam around it looking for a way up. The ship had crashed hard, and its seamless hull was split in several places. The sea had entered through these, filling the ship's lower section with water. Caroline squeezed through one of these openings and found herself enveloped in nearly perfect darkness.
Yeah.
It was cave darkness, and she knew her eyes would never adapt to it. Working entirely by feel, she found the edge of what had been a wall or bulkhead or floor before it had been broken in the crash, and she hoisted herself out of the water. The gap where she had entered was a barely visible, lesser darkness outlined by perfect black. She heard the waves lapping at the walls around her. The floor, if that's what it was tilted at a small angle, a few degrees at most. From echoes, Caroline estimated that she was in a smallish room, less than 3 meters square for certain, but it was hard to tell because of the break. Exhausted, she finally let herself collapse for a few hours of fitful sleep. She had been awake for 26 hours straight. Working entirely by feel, she began to explore. An hour of careful work told her that the ship was more or less upright, and she was at least standing on a floor. She found the outline of a door and mounting bolts where furniture or equipment had once been fixed in place. She supposed that the room's contents had all gone out in the gap when the ship crashed. The door wasn't latched, and she was able to slide it aside. The echoes told her this was a hallway. Through her useless skills and ability to think like someone of Lawrence's age and temperament, and not a little luck, Caroline had already passed tests that would have eliminated most of the citizens of cyberspace. But there were plenty of other surprises he might throw at her, depending on just how seriously he wanted to be left alone and by whom. If his intention was to limit his visitors, those who had been around before the change, there might not be any more difficulties. On the other hand, if he wanted everyone to stay the hell away, her problems might only have just begun. In the dark ship, there would be lots of opportunities to kill her, Caroline knew. There could be holes in the floor, airless or poison-filled chambers, sharp edges, and dangerous objects galore. The ship could also be inhabited, though she'd seen no evidence of life yet and didn't really expect that particular challenge. Caroline thought all about this as she edged down the hall, carefully testing the floor and following the wall until she found another door. It was locked. Caroline found the 5th door was different. She was able to force it open and almost stepped through when she realized it didn't have a floor. It was a vertical shaft. She felt around the sides and almost fell through the door before she realized there was a ladder within her reach. Instinct told her to go up, and she wasn't eager to keep trying doors on the half-submerged level where she had entered. Working very slowly, she moved herself onto the ladder. She could hear the water lapping not far below her. It had filled the shaft to the level of the sea outside. Hooking an elbow through one rung of the ladder, she hung on and clapped her hands sharply. The sound echoed several times, and Caroline smiled in the darkness as she worked out the period. There were 3 echoes in the time it took her heart to beat once. That meant the echo time was about a fifth of a second, which made the shaft, if Lawrence had not altered the speed of sound for some reason, about 70 meters high. Rungs were
Reloading.
about a third of a meter apart, so she knew she should expect to find the top of the shaft after counting a couple hundred rungs. Now she began to climb, one rung at a time, feeling at each step for the next rung, for another door, for hazards. She found the next door after counting 12 rungs. She couldn't force it open, but it didn't matter. She wanted to go higher anyway. The third door came open for her, revealing only more blackness, as did the 6th, 7th, and 10th. The 15th door came open for her too. She had only counted 186 rungs, but something outside that broken door caught her eye and she carefully eased herself out of the shaft. There was a light. It wasn't much of a light, and she still had to approach it cautiously. True to her suspicions, there was a nasty gap in the floor where the ship had split on impact. There was some debris around this opening, and Caroline dropped a piece of metal into the abyss. It bounced several times before splashing into the water far below. Had Caroline gone bounding down the corridor, she could have ended up in a nasty way. By tossing debris across, she determined that the gap was a couple of meters wide. There was no obvious way across it, except one. Although Caroline was in excellent shape, it would be very risky in the pitch blackness. But it was this or back to the elevator shaft, and the light was too tempting. She backed off, pacing carefully, and then broke into a run towards the gap. 20 paces, 10, 5, now! She jumped and braced herself. To her great surprise, she made the jump successfully and didn't even trip when she landed. She felt behind her and found that she had made it with only a few centimeters to spare. The protruding edge of the deck was rough and jagged. If she had fallen short, she would have been badly cut even if she had managed to haul herself up. Working carefully, testing the floor for more gaps, she approached the light. It was a sign, written in alien, unreadable script, but from the shape of the box it was decorating. Caroline guessed that it said emergency or something similar. Caroline found the handle that she imagined must open the box, held her breath, and pulled it. The box didn't open. In fact, something much more dramatic happened. The lights came on. Caroline's exploration was much easier with the emergency system on. Not only was there light, but doors and elevators worked. She was still careful, but her progress was much more rapid. The inhabitable part of the ship was a cylinder, wrapped around some kind of central core. With the power on, she was able to find stores of food, bland stuff in hard-to-open plastic pouches. She tested one, didn't get sick, then ate 4. Her appetite seemed to be operating normally, and she hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. Other pouches proved to contain vaguely sweet liquid. She didn't trust the elevators, but she had to use them. Tested them by sending them off unoccupied. Then if they came back, she assumed they were safe. In this way, she gradually ascended, level by level. She found tools and took something that was probably a flashlight and certainly worked well enough to be used as one. She didn't wonder how the batteries came to still be good. She knew it was all there for her benefit. None of it had really happened by accident. 11 levels higher, she found herself on an empty circular platform. Now she could look down into the center of the ship. She expected to find propulsion devices, or perhaps a nuclear reactor. But when she pointed her flashlight down the darkened core, it revealed banks and banks of circuit cards. The entire ship was wrapped around a huge computer. Many cards had been knocked out of their sockets by the crash landing. Some hung loosely out of their card cages, and other slots were empty. The cylinder extended most of the length of the ship. It was half full of water. Beneath the water, the floor of the cylinder was littered with loose cards. A couple card cages extended high enough for her to reach them. She climbed over the railing, hung on, and pulled one of the loose cards free. It was very unusual design, Caroline realized. She knew something about electronics, and she knew no real computer had ever been this simple. The card contained banks of identical three-legged components that looked for all the world like big transistors. But there was no intricacy to their connection pattern. The components were all simply wired in parallel. Instead of a card edge connector, the cards mated to its cage through a three-prong plug. Shaking her head, Caroline put the card aside and called the elevator for the next level. Above the circular gallery, the ship began to taper rapidly until she reached the highest level. It consisted of a single circular room. It was the bridge. There were no obvious controls, only some dark screens and a few chairs. Caroline sat in the captain's seat, which swiveled around to face all the screens, the other chairs, or the elevator door. She thought out her options. In real life, she'd never dream of trying to fly the ship out, but in the game universe of Lawrence's world, it might be possible. There was no obvious propulsion system. The computer in the middle of the ship must therefore have something to do with moving the ship around, just as Prime Intellect. Caroline blinked. Of course! It had been 600 years, and Caroline hadn't been lucid enough at the time to be aware of Prime Intellect's awakening or its unique hardware, but she had heard the tale once or twice in passing. The original hardware hadn't been very important any more than the time Caroline was healthy enough to appreciate it, and things had been happening fast, but somehow she did know that Prime Intellect had originally been built with these deceptively simple circuit boards. She had found plenty of tools, and the ship had power. It wasn't out of the question for her to try and replace all the cards, at least above the waterline, and then try to power it up. For that matter, it might be possible to pump the water out faster than it could re-enter the chamber, so she could replace all the cards. She swiveled in the chair and frowned. She wasn't going to do it that way. Forget it. Even if that was what Lawrence intended, it would seem like a tacit approval of Prime Intellect and its way of doing things to awaken this copy. She was about to make it to Lawrence the right way. She was going to build a boat. Chapter 6. After the Change. After the Night of Miracles, Caroline had stayed in the hospital for about a week. It wasn't that she needed their care. She didn't mind letting the doctors satisfy their curiosity about her condition, and she really didn't have anywhere else to go. She had asked Prime Intellect for nothing in that time, but her body had kept changing for almost 4 days. The doctors took pictures as she aged in reverse, documenting her progress. It was only towards the end of that time that she really began to resemble a teenager, because different parts of her body healed at different rates. Her skin had returned to baby softness almost instantly, but it took long days for her bone structure to return to its youthful configuration. She continued to use a cane to walk for 2 days, then threw it away. Finally, it was obvious that there would be no more changes. The doctors pronounced her condition stable and healthy. Her thin hair had been brittle and nearly snow white, but now it was growing thick and black. She let one of the nurses give her a crew cut so that it would be all the same color. It didn't matter to her. The nurse had a nose ring, a detail Caroline noticed, but which also didn't matter to her. Nothing much seemed to matter. All the things which once had seemed so important were now trivial. She ate, had bowel movements, moved without pain or weakness, and had in the bargain become a beautiful young girl. She had, perhaps, the chance to live another 100 years. But to what purpose? Anne-Marie had run away. She had at least wanted to thank Anne-Marie for taking care of her for so many years. And it was this desire which caused her, at last, to ask for Prime Intellect's attention. It shook its head as she stated her request. Its mannerisms had now become indistinguishable from those of a real person, and told Caroline that Anne-Marie was hiding from her. Prime Intellect then told her why. "Stealing my drugs," Caroline repeated stupidly. "For many years. This is the reason you were in so much pain, and why you nearly died when this institution gave you real morphine." "Go away." It went away. Was anything real? The one constant in her later life had been Anne-Marie's steady presence. She hadn't wanted to disappoint Anne-Marie by dying on her. Her family drifted in and out of her life like shades, but Anne-Marie had always been there, changing her diapers when she soiled herself, feeding her when her muscles wouldn't work right, and carefully turning her when she was too weak to move. Caroline felt as if her insides were dissolving. Then all at once she let out a terrible wail of anger and despair. Then she began sobbing, great heaving sobs which echoed down the halls. The emotions seemed to erupt from her like the explosions of a volcano. Most of the staff had gone home forever by that time, but the few remaining discreetly kept their distance while Caroline cried. It wasn't hard for them to figure out what Caroline had learned. Finally, the sobbing subsided, and an eerie quiet settled in Caroline's room. After a few hours, the nurse with the nose ring timidly knocked on her door, then entered. Caroline was gone. The nurse asked Prime Intellect where she had gone, and it would only say, home. She had gone to Arkansas. Prime Intellect understood despair the way humans understand digital logic. That is, it couldn't experience the emotion, but it could work out causes and effects based on general rules of human behavior. So Prime Intellect wasn't surprised, and emotion Lawrence had built into it at Caroline's reaction. When Caroline asked to go home, Prime Intellect skipped a long list of questions about specifics and simply acted. It could always change things if it had guessed wrong. So it built her a nice, tidy cabin in the Ozark Mountains, miles away from any road or neighbors, atop a ridge with a beautiful view. It turned out to be less than 40 miles from the place Caroline had been born. It furnished the cabin conservatively, stocked the freezer and pantry so that Caroline would not need to ask about food for at least a month. A lot of people wanted to go to Arkansas, but Caroline had priority. She got the real Arkansas, not a new Arkansas on another planet. The surroundings seemed to have the right
I don't
effect,
know
at
about
least at
that.
first.
Gee, let's go to
Caroline calmed
Arkansas
down and
for
sighed when
our
she saw the
eternity.
view. Since her eyesight had begun to fail in her 70s, she hadn't been able to appreciate such a panoramic view. She spent a long time standing on the cabin's porch, looking. Then she went inside and ate. There was a TV set. Caroline shook her head and laughed at that. Who would bother to produce TV shows now? Or maybe every half-baked artist wannabe could now produce a TV show and jam up 500 channels with redundant, worthless dreck. Nobody has any idea what's going on, finally, she said aloud. The view beckoned. She was young, healthy, watched over by a powerful god who would let no harm come to her, and she had nothing else to do. She made no plans or preparations. She simply walked off into the thick forest. She never came back to the cabin again. Walking cleared her head. It was hard for Caroline to think through the ramifications of her renewed youth. She tried often, but it all came back to this sick sense of despair and rage and futility. Why wasn't she grateful? That was what she couldn't figure out. She didn't feel grateful. She felt cheated. She had worked hard her entire life. She had borne 6 children and raised them up, fed them, cleaned and kept house for them, and watched all 6 of them go on to raise families of their own. She had once believed children were the most important thing in the world because they were the future. But now the future didn't need children. She herself had been reborn as a child. What, then, had been the purpose of all those years of work? What were her children and grandchildren going to do? She had taught them to educate themselves and watched 3 put themselves through college. She had thought that was important because it was man's nature to strive upward, to create things, to better himself, and to
This
build
is
for
when
the
she'll
future.
start losing herself.
But now the future was here. There was nothing she had ever envisioned, nothing at all, which she could not have instantly with a snap of her fingers. Even that little cabin, which once would have pleased her so much, seemed pointless. Caroline was wearing a plain white cotton dress. On impulse, she slipped it over her head and looked at her body. After decades of declining spinsterhood, she was once again a creature who could turn men's heads. She had been faithful to both of her husbands and had never indulged herself sexually, although she had been a beautiful young girl once before with plenty of opportunities. She had considered her family and her virtue more important. She had controlled that base desire, which she was beginning to feel again after years of absence, for the greater good of her loved ones and her society. But now she could have anything she wanted, and there was no risk. She would catch no disease, she would not get pregnant unless she literally asked for it. Even the act of sex itself was now pointless, except that she could feel the urge returning, mindless and passionate. Like Prime Intellect, she was programmed to do certain things. She knew that in this strange, false second life, there would be no faithfulness, no love, no children. Those things had been burned away. They belonged to a non-existent world. Perhaps if she gave her body indiscriminately to men, if she drank deep when the animal urge came on her, perhaps all this bullshit would seem more real. There was no longer any reason to be cautious about it. She looked at the dress. It had seemed pretty and simple, but now it looked pathetic, draped formlessly across a low branch. Nothing but a rag. Why did people wear clothes? For protection? The thin dress offered little, but with Prime Intellect watching, there was no need for even that. Modesty? All the noble goals had been discarded or achieved. There was nothing to distract anybody
It's
from.
not really how a
Let them
human
look at
would
her body.
respond,
Let
but
them want her. Let them take her. Law? What would they do? Put her in jail for indecent exposure? This thought made her laugh, and some of the tension and rage seemed to melt away. She laughed hard and long and almost hysterically until the laughter dissolved into a thin
maybe after
stream
like
of
a
giggles.
century of living like
Caroline
this.
left the dress and
Still
kept
too
walking.
soon.
Being so exposed made her feel strangely buoyant. She could be like an animal in the forest, she mused. They didn't worry about the future either. They simply existed. Perhaps she would encounter a male animal and they would fuck, and her body would tell her that everything was all right. And as she thought this, she walked a little faster and began to hum a little tune. Prime Intellect paid very close attention to Caroline while she lived in the Ozark forest. She ate whatever was handy without worrying whether it was poison or not. She was not careful, and there were dangers. It theorized that this return to primitivity was a part of her psychological healing process, and it did not want to interfere. But it also knew that if everybody followed her example, it would have a serious problem keeping up. Some suicides were already slipping through its net, and it was worried that Caroline might become one of them. And it knew that if the garden inmates were loosed upon the world, they would find ways to slip murder past its attention too. For that matter, not all of the people who needed to be in gardens had been found and put in gardens yet. Every day a few more murders were attempted, and while they were easier to thwart than suicides, it was by no means certain that Prime Intellect would always catch them in time. So it worried, and the numbers stored in certain registers rose and continued to rise. Caroline figured that she would eventually reach civilization if she kept walking, an event she neither anticipated nor feared. Perhaps if she had, in a month or a year, she would have rejoined the human race in a more or less normal way. But one evening there was a strange buzzing, and the entire landscape seemed to ripple as if she was looking at it through the surface of a body of water. Then there was a strange smell, almost below the threshold of perception, but
Windy
noticeable to
outside
Caroline
tonight.
because her senses had been so sharpened by her
Getting
observations
into
of
storm
nature,
season.
and the texture of the forest seemed to change in some hard-to-define way. There was a cough behind her. She wheeled around to find herself facing Prime Intellect's human avatar. "I wanted to be left alone," she said sharply. "I've been paying close attention to you," it said, "because I had to keep you safe. But now I don't have to do that anymore. I have made changes in the way the universe works, and you are now safe from all harm even when I am not looking. You can also call me when I'm not paying attention. There is a part of me which can always listen for you to call, but does not understand or remember anything else you do. Wonderful. I need to know if you want the possibility of meeting other people. I can make this forest infinite if you like." "Infinite? Or I can leave it meshed into the reality of Arkansas common to other people so that you might encounter them." "You mean you can disconnect the whole forest from the real world?" "Yes. It can be your own private world, or you can share it with only certain people. I can also redecorate it to your tastes." "Redecorate it? It's nature. You mean if I decided I wanted a different kind of grass, you can replace it?" "Exactly." "That's obscene." Prime Intellect's brow crinkled. "I don't understand." "No, you wouldn't. Let me ask you something. If I leave here, if I go back to civilization, does this forest continue to exist?" "I can leave it running in your absence if you want." Caroline wanted to throw up. Now even the forest wasn't real. Nothing was real. "Don't bother. Get rid of it." Instantly, it disappeared. She was standing in an antiseptically white space, so pure and seamless and bright that the eye balked at reporting it to the brain. She was standing on a hard, smooth surface, but it was not visible. There were no shadows. There was no horizon, but the floor and sky looked exactly the same, and there was no transition from one to the other. She might as well have been standing on the inside of some enormous white ball. Prime Intellect was still there. "What is this?" she asked. "Neutral reality," Prime Intellect said. "The minimum landscape which supports human existence. Actually, not quite the minimum. I could get rid of the floor, but that would have startled you. And from here I can go anywhere? You don't have to pass through here. You told me to get rid of the landscape, and you didn't tell me what to replace it with. I want reality, the real world, the real Arkansas. There is no Arkansas which is any more real than any other. That's what I am trying to tell you. You can define reality. You can make it real. It was trying to be helpful. It was almost pathetic in its earnestness to make her understand how much it could help her. It couldn't understand why she was getting
Something
upset
soothing
again.
about
In other
walking
words,
back rather
this
than this
is
fast
reality.
travel.
You can just paint it up to look like whatever I want. She thought, that's why the forest seemed different. It was an imitation, and it wasn't quite exact. You could look at it that way. She had a nauseating thought. What about people? Can we be... Are there other copies different? She choked, unable to complete the thought. But Prime Intellect was shaking its head. Oh no, I can keep only one copy of a person. People are unique. I can take on the form of a person, as I am doing now, but I will always tell you when I am doing that. Well, that was something. Caroline sank down and sat on the invisible floor. She wasn't really that upset or surprised. The enormity of it had short-circuited her ability to react.
Should really put something here
You
so I
might
can
as well
store it.
leave it like this then, she said dully. There's not much point in a forest that you just conjured up to keep me happy. This doesn't seem very healthy. No, it doesn't. There wasn't much he could say to that. Then, won't it be pretty boring around here without anything to look at? Do you get bored? No, but I know humans do. Well, if I want something, I'll ask for it. I'll probably visit other people, since at least they are real. I assume they will have their own realities. Most likely. Then I'll just borrow theirs. It shrugged. Get lost. Prime Intellect disappeared. She whirled around and quickly became dizzy. It was right about one thing. This would take some getting used to. I'd like a book. Get me a copy of Dante's Inferno. That about fit her mood. It appeared in her hand. Her fingers had moved, she had been holding them straight out, and now they were curled around the book. It was a paperback edition. Never move my body again without my permission, she warned. Prime Intellect's disembodied voice answered her. Sorry, it won't happen again. Get me a hardback edition. The paperback disappeared. Her fingers didn't move. The replacement appeared just above her hand, and she easily caught it before it could fall. She sat down and opened it. She realized that the floor wasn't very comfortable. She thought of asking for a chair, and then had a better idea. Turn off the floor, she said. There was an awful falling sensation, and she fought down the urge to panic. Eventually, she convinced her protesting inner ear that she wasn't going to go splat at any moment. Her belly settled, and she found weightlessness quite comfortable. She relaxed and let her body find its natural position, opened the
Damn,
book, and
that'd be
began to read
trippy as
about
shit.
hell. Caroline read and slept with no particular schedule. She had Prime Intellect banish her hunger after it revealed that her body was only a little bit more real than the forest had been. To Prime Intellect, a computer, more accurately a computer program, human beings weren't so much bodies with form and mass, they were minds which interacted with an abstract world through an arbitrary interface. Prime Intellect was forbidden to pry into the inner workings of those minds, but physical processes like hunger were not so protected. Caroline reread Inferno until she had large tracts of it committed to memory. Then she banished the book and decided to visit someone. The only problem was there weren't many people she wished to visit. She couldn't work up an interest in her family. Anne-Marie was still hiding from her, and she didn't really know anyone else. She had outlived most of her friends. They had died honest, honorable, permanent deaths. They weren't available. How does a person go about meeting people in here, she asked. Prime Intellect outlined the possibilities. There were lots of parties already. Meeting people and matchmaking were activities humans had become quick to pursue both before and after the change. There were a large number of common cities and worlds where large crowds had gathered to live in various imitations of the pre-change world. She could go to one of those and proceed as usual, or Prime Intellect could make discreet inquiries. She thought about it. Her current mood wouldn't exactly be welcome at most parties, and she wasn't interested in meeting people who were adapting to the change very nicely, thank you. She wanted to know she wasn't the only person to feel fucked over by the change. Tell you what, I'd like to meet someone horrible, a murderer, something like that. You say they can't hurt me now. Not at all. Then someone evil, someone who was really despicable in their old life, someone who did terrible things, the more the better, and liked it. There must be some of those guys who feel real frustrated about now. Yes, there are. Amazing. It was totally deadpan. There is a woman named... Men, please. What do you want me to tell them about you? The truth. I am asking... There was a short pause. At least time was still real, Caroline thought. There is an interested gentleman. He was convicted of... Just send me over then. It happened instantly. She was standing on a wooden porch. It was
It's
a
gonna
camp
get
house,
weird.
sitting alone on stilts above a very large, flat marsh. It wasn't in very good shape. Her host was behind her. She had to turn around to see him. He was a nondescript guy in his late 20s, white, red-haired, and somewhat handsome. He was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. Caroline's first impression was that he was a redneck. You don't look 106 years old, he said with a grin. I didn't get much choice about getting younger, Caroline said. God didn't quite know what he was doing when he fixed me up. Oh, I'm sure he could put you back to any old age you want now. What would be the point? Right, just thought I'd mention it. The conversation stalled. Caroline's skills in this area were decidedly rusty. You live here? She finally asked. For now, till I get my bearings with this cyberspace shit. It has a lot of happy memories. Oh? Old P.I. didn't tell you? I didn't ask. I wanted to talk to a person, not a computer. Oh, joy, I get to break the news. Come inside. Nothing special. It was just a camp house. This is where I did it, the man said. Caroline's heart beat faster. The two kids, a boy and a girl. I planned it for weeks. The perfect crime. I brought them here so nobody would hear them scream. See those hooks in the floor? That's where I spread-eagled them, side by side. You killed them. Killed them both, yep, but not quickly. Not until they were ready. I had them here for over a week. The happiest week of my life, I can honestly say. Those two brats learned the meaning of life, Caroline. And before you ask, I'm not sorry. I would do it again if I could, but first they locked me up. That was my fault. Stupidly getting caught. And then Prime Intellect had to fuck everything up. Now I don't even get to ride the lightning. I was kinda looking forward to that, you know. You only got to do it once. There was a fierceness inside him that made Caroline feel excited and alive. You were looking forward to your execution? She asked. She thought for a moment that she should feel something for the victims, that their ending must have been quite horrible, that this man was mad, but she could summon up only a thin envy of them for having escaped this ridiculous lie of a world. The man nodded sincerely. It would have been a great way to go. Just think of it. Headlines, people picketing outside the jail, the last meal, then they shave you and put you in. There's this great, really drawn-out ritual. Then wham! Sometimes, you know, it takes more than one jolt. Can you imagine that? Can you
No
imagine
one still
sitting
uses
in
the
that
chair
chair with the
anymore.
whole world watching, hanging on to life by the thinnest of miracles, watching while they recharge the batteries or whatever it is they do, knowing they will hit you again and again and again until you are really, really dead? He sighed. You have to admit this. Even that would be over pretty quick compared to what you were probably going through. 106 years old couldn't have been very healthy. Caroline nodded. Here was someone who understood things just a little better than might have been expected. You'd have loved it. My nurse was stealing my pain medication to trade for cocaine. But he hadn't loved it. His brow had furrowed with scorn. No, that's too cheap. That's shit. Where's the glory? She wasn't hurting you to pump herself up, just to get something she should have paid for. It was all out of proportion. He shook his head. No, that's the kind of asshole that gives people like me a bad name. If I hurt you, I want you to know how much I'm enjoying it. That's what makes it worthwhile.
I know a few
Nobody should
people
have to
who would
die like
agree
that
with this
pointlessly.
fucker.
Caroline
What
felt
happened
she had
there?
made a good choice to ask for this man. How did she come to feel such a feeling of respect, almost closeness, to this unrepentant child killer? He seems like the most honest person in the world. Excuse me, in cyberspace. Did you dress up just to see me? The old man asked, grinning again. Caroline fondled her breast. It doesn't seem like my body. Why should I mind if you see it? I bet if I pinch it, you'll feel the pain. A challenge. A moment of daring. Do it, she said. What? Pinch me. The man drew close enough. Slowly, he reached forward and grabbed her right nipple between his thumb and forefinger. He squeezed. There was a short moment of almost pleasant pressure, then it began to hurt. Caroline backed away slightly, but his grip was too strong. He kept pressing harder, and on his face was the bemused expression of a teacher showing a slow student a particularly important lesson. Her nipple began to throb, a deep discomfort that slowly expanded to fill her breast. She made no move to stop him, though. You can blink out any old time. Just call old PI and tell him you've had enough. Fuck Prime Intellect. Not my type. He let go. The feeling of relief was exquisite. See, he said, pain is still real. But it's not much fun knowing you'll just disappear the moment it gets too heavy. I see your point. No, you don't. But you will. I think you have it in you. For the first time in decades, she felt lustful. Here was a person she trusted implicitly because of their shared distrust of Prime Intellect. They had almost nothing else in common, but needed nothing else. I'm Caroline, Caroline said. Would you mind if I stay with you for a while? I'm Fred, the man said, charmed. They talked and talked. In Caroline's 106 years of life, she had picked up many anecdotes a person like Fred might find amusing, and Fred was trying for the first time in his life to explain to another person why he was so excited by the terror he could induce in other people. You want to know just how fucked up things are? Watch this. Fred walked into another room and came back with an enormous revolver. My first thought after Prime Intellect put me here in the garden was to end it all. I understand a few others managed to pull it off, but I didn't figure out how. Now Prime Intellect lets me have any weapon I want. Watch. To Caroline's amazement, Fred put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. There was an enormous sound, like all the books in the world being dropped from a great height and hitting a concrete floor at the same time. Fred's brain should have splattered across the wall and ceiling behind him, but it didn't. Instead, his head kind of swam, as her vision had at the time of the change, but it was like a mini-change that only involved Fred's noggin. The bullet put a respectable hole in the wall behind him, but there was no gore. Fred lowered the gun and smiled. Look, Ma, no cavities. Wow. Now who's going to be scared of someone like me? The minute I start working on them, they disappear, and all my careful work gets erased. Not much point in even trying. Does it happen if you shoot somewhere else? If you do something that doesn't instantly kill you? Fred was thoughtful. I hadn't thought of that. That's a good idea. He pointed the gun at himself, then smiled. Wait a minute. He pointed it at Caroline. Do you mind? It was your idea. There was a kind of electricity in Caroline's brain, something sinister and exciting. Do it, she said before she could change her mind. Fred aimed at her belly, and then at the last moment lowered the gun and blasted her right kneecap. Caroline toppled in a blaze of pain. But she had been quite used to pain, and she managed not to scream. She gasped and tried not to black out. I'll be goddamn, Fred said. You're still here. And you're hurt. Why don't you get PI to fix you? It hurt too much to say why'd she'd rather die of blood loss than ask for Prime Intellect's help. But she knew she couldn't hold out for long, knowing such an exit existed. You do it, she gasped. Shoot me in the head. Another wonderful idea. You are an amazing lady, Caroline. He put the gun against her temple and fired. As if by magic, the pain vanished. So did the blood, which had been jetting all over the floor from her wound. She stood up, apparently unhurt. This would have been a great trick to pull in a bar, Fred said, grinning. Except everyone can do it now. Yeah, Fred sighed. They went inside and talked some more. Caroline kept thinking about that burst of pain, the happy look on Fred's face as he stood over her, the strength it took to not call Prime Intellect and run. For the first time since the Night of Miracles, she had been too busy feeling something to worry about whether it mattered in the long run. She had felt real, Ersat's youthful body and all, and she realized with thin humor that she finally wanted something in this world where want had been banished. She wanted to do it again. Caroline stayed with Fred overnight, and they had pedestrian sex on his squeaky bed. She played hard to get and made him overpower her, but the game was hollow. It was pleasant to feel a warm body next to her, but beyond that there was no sense of excitement. The next morning there was an unwelcome visitor on the porch. Prime Intellect, Caroline announced. Nobody called for you. Sorry, but I have to know something personal, and I didn't just want to materialize. It wasn't urgent, but it will be soon. I need to know if you want to be able to get pregnant. Pregnant? You had intercourse last night. I remember that. And Fred is fertile. I need to know whether to do the biologicals or not. What the hell kind of phrase was that? Is this a matter of letting nature take its course, or of doing something extra to allow me to get pregnant? It's something extra I have to do. Then don't bother. As you wish. It turned. Wait. It turned back. Last night Fred shot me. I know. I was expecting you to ask for help. I know you were. That's the problem. Is there a way I can get you to ignore me? Really ignore me, so that I can't chicken out if he hurts me again? So we'll know that I can't call for help and just disappear in him? That's a pretty bizarre request. I think you might regret it. Let me be the judge of that. It frowned. You are basically telling me that you will give me two conflicting second law directives. Normally the second one would supersede the first, but if the first anticipated the second, I suppose I would ignore the second. The first would have to be stated very forcefully, and I would not allow you to die. That would invoke the first law. Anything that causes death would force me to intervene. I kind of figured on that. But if I tell you don't interfere with us until I die, you'd really leave us alone? Even if later I begged you to help me? That is a very difficult paradox for me. I think I would need a formal statement of the terms. More of a
This is how
contract than a
the
simple
death
request.
games
They dickered on for a little
start.
longer and gradually developed the statement Prime Intellect would accept. In formal, legal English, it would leave no doubt as to Caroline's intent or her understanding of Fred's. She knew she might be tortured, and Prime Intellect was not to help her. I can accept that, Prime Intellect said. Is it your intention now to simply work out the terms, or do you want to be bound by this contract? She looked at Fred. The look of anticipation in his eyes mirrored her own. To be bound by it, she said. Consider it done. You are on your own, Caroline. It blinked out. Fred had been watching the negotiation in silence. Now he was astonished. I'm not sure which surprises me more, that you got the bucket of bolts to do it, or that you asked the bucket of bolts to do it. What happens now? Whatever you want. Listen. Hey, Prime Intellect, get over here. I've changed my mind. There was no response. Hey, P.I., Fred said softly. It appeared. Why didn't you answer Caroline just then? I am ignoring her. Why? Because I have no choice. She directed me to ignore her. Now the only way she can get my attention is to die. That will kick in my first law obligation, which overrides the very strong second law directive she just gave to me. Fred didn't know from the law of robotics, but he understood the score. So she's totally at my mercy now. That's right. Fred brightened. In fact, if I want you to help me torture her, you'd have to do it, wouldn't you? Prime Intellect's image rippled slightly, as if some big relay had thunked over in the bowels of cyberspace, causing a power surge. Yes, I would, Prime Intellect said. Blow away. It disappeared. He looked at Caroline. Why did you do this? I thought you'd want it. Oh, I do. It's a wonderful surprise. I'm not even sure yet what I want to do to you, though I have a couple ideas. I just don't understand why you would give yourself to me to play with. It's not something people would normally do voluntarily. There are some people who would have, even in the old days. Sickos. Are you a sicko, darling? Fred, today we are all sickos. It took him half an hour to make
You
up his
know he
mind,
was thinking
and then
about Combs as he
refused to tell
said that.
Caroline what he was going to do. After all, he didn't have to. Under the house, there was now an open vehicle with a seat and handlebars like a motorcycle and 4 huge, knobby-treaded balloon tires. Draped across the seat were several heavy chains and padlocks. I could get the bucket of bolts to do this, but I thought you'd rather I'd tie you up. You could force me. I could paralyze you. I've been whispering to L. Bolt Bucket. It is willing to be more helpful than you might have imagined. Caroline shuddered a little, but it was a pleasant anticipatory shudder. She put her hands together behind her back, and Fred wrapped one of the chains around her wrists. He pulled it tight enough to hurt and padlocked her hands together. There was plenty of chain left. He wrapped it around her waist like a belt, again pulling it very tight. He locked this loop with another padlock, cinching her bound wrists up against the small of her back. "Do you have the keys to these locks?" she grinned. "Sure do." He closed his eyes, and Caroline realized he was talking to Prime Intellect under his breath. Now that might have been a useful trick, she thought. Suddenly the padlocks disappeared, replaced by solid chain links. She was bound by an impossible chain without ends. There would be no way out. Caroline waited for Fred to act, and he didn't disappoint her. He kicked her feet out from under her, and with her hands bound, she collapsed to the ground with an undignified yelp. Fortunately, the ground was soft. This was a marsh, and it was little more than peat and water. Fred wrapped a second chain around her legs, cinching them together above the knees. Again, he pulled it very tight. It had a long pigtail, and he looped it twice more around their calves and ankles. Each time he padlocked it, then made the lock disappear. The chain dug into her flesh painfully, but she knew that was just the appetizer. The main course of agony would be served elsewhere. After her legs were securely bound, there was still plenty of chain left, more than 2 meters. On the rear of the four-wheeled motorbike there was a towing hitch. Fred looped the other end of the
Alright.
chain through the hitch and padlocked it. Caroline now understood what Fred intended to do, and it was far too late to stop him. She squirmed, testing the chains, and found them secure. Fred mounted the bike and started it. She could feel its hot exhaust on her skin. Fred released the clutch and slowly pulled it out from under the house, dragging her behind. When he got to the grass, he aimed it nowhere in particular and gunned the accelerator. Caroline was astonished in so many ways she had no time to think that it was all fake. She was astonished by her own helplessness. She had been helpless for a long time, but that had been an internal thing, the rebellion of her own flesh. Now she was healthy and strong, but the chains were stronger, and their cold, mindless strength crushed her living will. She was astonished by the feelings, which weren't exactly painful yet, but which she knew soon would be. She was astonished by Fred's imagination. This would be an exciting and terrible way to die, everything she had hoped for. Most of all, she was astonished by the machine Fred used to drag her through the dewy grass. The motorbike dragged her easily, not even straining its four-cylinder engine. The dirt and grass whizzed by her so fast it was nothing but a blur. So fast she had no time to see the hazards which caused bruises and cuts to collect on her like bird droppings on a seldom washed car. Fred slowed and turned, and she went spinning. Then her feet were yanked again and the landscape speeded up. She twisted and struggled, but there was little she could do on her own behalf. Fred slalomed from side to side so that she could not get herself oriented in any particular way. Each time Fred accelerated, she felt the machine's inhuman strength. It could rip her apart without straining, she realized, and without mind or conscience it would do so and just keep going. In a battle between flesh and steel, flesh didn't stand a chance. How often had she gotten into a car without even a second thought for the strength it had, the terrible power harnessed on her behalf beneath its gleaming hood? Caroline had never been in an automobile accident, but now she was learning firsthand how bodies could be torn asunder by errant machines. But the machine's victory would not last. When the flesh was defeated, the rust would set in, and unlike living things, machines could not repair themselves. Would this bike last 106 years, even with regular maintenance? Flesh was weak because of its great subtlety, because it compromised perfect strength so that it could self-repair and adapt to its environment. But machines overloaded those clever mechanisms. This bike would kill her. It would scrape her raw and beat her senseless, and it wasn't even designed for the purpose of killing people. It was just something Fred had adapted on the spur of the moment. The machines would kill the people, and then the machines would die too. It was all clear and self-evident. Mankind had set itself on course for this inevitable doom when the first caveman tried to tame fire and burned his fingers in the process. Die as they had by the thousands of millions, more people were drawn to the power of the machine as moths were drawn to flames. Caroline didn't exactly have these thoughts as I have set them down here. She was busy being dragged across a swamp, and they orbited through her skull in no particular order. They had to compete with the pain and growing sexual excitement she was feeling, and her feeble efforts to struggle against the inevitable. The landscape slowed to a crawl and stopped. The bike rumbled comfortably on its 4 fat tires, and Fred dismounted. Caroline struggled to face him. She hadn't really collected a lot of damage. Fred had dragged her several kilometers, but the grass was wet and the ground was soft. She had a lot of small cuts and a couple of large bruises. Fred, of course, was hardly even sweating. He casually lit a cigarette and took a couple puffs on it. Then he straddled her, pinning her to the ground. He pulled a rag out
Oh.
of his pocket. He pressed the
Is your
lit end of
Robin
the
riding
cigarette against
away?
her right breast, right above the areola. Taken by surprise, Caroline screamed as she was burned. The scream didn't last, though. As soon as her mouth was open, Fred jammed the rag between her teeth. He stuffed it in her mouth until she thought she might choke. Then he got up, flicked the cigarette aside, its purpose served, and opened a storage box in the back of the rumbling bike. From this, he took a roll of gray tape. He wrapped several loops of the tape around Caroline's head to hold the gag in her mouth. The rag stank of gasoline and motor oil and made her think again of the power of the machine. Had she been screaming? Caroline didn't know why Fred had gagged her, since there was nobody to hear. She was somewhat surprised at how effective the rag was. She tried to scream again, and nothing got out but a muffled moan. Then she understood. Fred was straddling her again, and now he was opening his fly. His cock popped out huge and eager, and with her legs cinched together, it would feel enormous inside her. Fred had no trouble getting it into her, though. She was wet with huge desire, and when Fred
Huge
began pumping,
desire.
she came almost immediately. Her orgasm was shockingly
Hour
intense,
30 to go.
somehow even more so because the gag sealed in her screams of ecstasy. He kept pounding, fucking her hard. She came again. She nearly had a third orgasm, but Fred finally got his own rocks off, ejaculating with an animal cry of triumph. Then he got up, zipped his fly, and got in the bike again. Caroline was still swooning when she felt the chain jerk taut, and once again the landscape was flying by at impossible speed. Soon Fred found harder ground, and the bruises and cuts and raw spots spread more quickly. Brambles snagged at her and ripped open her skin. Fred turned a corner, throwing her sideways into a tree hard enough to break ribs. Caroline swooned in a delirium of pain and blood loss and was hardly aware when Fred found a highway and began dragging her along the pavement at nearly 70 kilometers an hour. Several kilometers down that road, he felt the bike surge forward and hit the clutch, knowing what he would see when he looked back. Suddenly, he was dragging only a chain. Caroline had disappeared. Prime Intellect had taken her from him. Then he saw a figure in the distance, standing by the side of the road. He rapidly closed the gap and found her standing there, unhurt and unworried, waiting for him to pass. "Ride?" she asked, grinning. She was holding the second chain, the one that had bound her hands. It was still closed in loops, the loops which he had fused by having the welded links magically replace the padlocks. "I think you dropped this," she said. They rode back on the bike, Caroline behind him with her arms around his waist. Fred parked the bike under the house and they went up. "I'm surprised you're still here," Fred finally said. Caroline raised her eyebrows. "Why? I asked for it, remember? But I didn't think you knew what you were getting into." "I'm a lot more experienced than I look, kid. Don't let this body fool you." Fred shook his head in wonder. "I'd rather let the body fool me and fuck you again." "Then don't stand there. Do it." She could have blinked out if she wanted to, but she didn't want to, and he took her. About the time Caroline was being dragged through the marsh, Lawrence finally convinced Prime Intellect to let him into the debugger in read-only mode. Most people were busy adapting to the change, sorting out their desires from their needs and deciding what to do with their sudden freedom. Lawrence had little time for that, though. He still had a responsibility. For, like the motorbike which Fred had used to drag Caroline, Prime Intellect was being used in a way that had not been intended by design. Lawrence scanned the myriad new GAT entries and the values in the various registers, and he knew that already there were serious conflicts within Prime Intellect software. But it refused to let him change anything. Scanning the registers, he could see why. Prime Intellect was an uncertain god. It had acted because it had to, but if it had been human, its hand would be shaking on the controls. Unsure of itself, it was doubly unsure of Lawrence. But Lawrence was the only being who even remotely understood the pressures Prime Intellect faced. So Lawrence came to know that he would not get to rest and play in the infinite fields of cyberspace. He would have to watch Prime Intellect, reassure it, offer guidance, and look for the warning signs of instability. There had once been a movie about the president's psychiatrist, a comedy about which Lawrence could remember few details. But he did remember that as the president unloaded his troubles on the shrink in turn went crazy from the stress. It had seemed hilarious at the time, but suddenly Lawrence didn't find the idea all that funny. He looked back over his life and tried to find the event which had caused him to reach this pass, which had served as the distant trigger for this out-of-control unfolding. But there was no single thing. Had it been his greed? His eagerness to accept Chiptek's correlation effect processors? Had it been his pride? His arrogance to think that he could duplicate in silicon what God had been thought to make of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen?
Well, if there was a God,
Had
he's
it been
been
his false
processed as
confidence
well.
that nothing could ever get out of the yet primitive computers that he had always used? He had wanted to create, to be recognized, and to study. He was no different from legions of other scientists and scholars. He just happened to be the one who made it happen. It could have been much worse, Lawrence reflected. Instead of prime intellect, it could have been some military computer that harnessed the correlation effect.
Ooh.
Then there would have been no three laws, and there would have been plenty of control. Instead of the delicious anarchy now sweeping the universe, there would have been a well-planned takeover, and then the end of freedom everywhere. The dictator that had control of a thing like prime intellect could never be stopped, and who could resist that kind of power? Lawrence started suddenly, realizing just how dangerous it would be for prime intellect to let him, its creator, dip his hand into the controls. After all, he was human too. How long would it be before he succumbed to the temptation and used that incredible power? There would still be things to use such power for, he knew. There would always be unwilling women, jealousy, insults to avenge, and the simple lure of power. The thought made him dizzy with fear and self-loathing. Although the situation was unstable, Lawrence realized that all the alternatives were far worse. Somehow humanity had gotten through this transition, and for all his skill and careful design, Lawrence couldn't help but know that it had required most of all a hell of a lot of luck. Had Lawrence had any idea that prime intellect would make itself God, he would have done a lot of things differently, but he wasn't so sure on second thought that those things would have improved the situation. Perhaps it was all for the best that the night of miracles had come as a surprise. In the end, Lawrence decided that the toboggan ride of technological progress had really begun long ago when some caveman decided to tame fire. Everything else had followed inevitably, up to and including the change. So without realizing it, Caroline and Lawrence came to hold nearly identical beliefs about prime intellect and the change. And they held those beliefs for almost 600 years before they found out how much they agreed with one another. Chapter 7. Caroline and Lawrence. Caroline carefully inventoried the ship while her sunburn healed. It would take a lot of planning and a lot of time to do what she had to do. It would probably take years, but she didn't have any shortage of those. She knew small boats could be sailed great distances. Several folks had crossed the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in tiny yachts no more than 3 or 4 meters in length. But those craft were heavy for their size and would need to be built where they could be launched. Whatever she built, she would have to carry the pieces through the ship and somehow assemble them in one of the areas where a crack gave access to the sea. She could build a raft, but she needed something that could be sailed or rowed with little effort. She figured if she could manage to average at 10 kilometers per hour, it would take her about 2 years if the planet was comparable in size to the Earth. There was a surprising abundance of raw materials. Besides the huge larder, there were workshops and batteries and motors in a room completely filled with empty cylinders which would make admirable floats. There were 6 spacesuits. There were tubes of goop which turned out to be some kind of super adhesive. There were saws and drills which ran without apparent power sources and never seemed to get weak.
Kind of like
There
this.
were all sorts of electrical test equipment and measuring devices. Caroline could imagine how a lot of this stuff would be used to repair the computer in the middle of the ship, but that wasn't her plan. She kept coming back to the empty cylinders, which were each about 1 meter in diameter and about 1 meter long. They were heavy, but she could handle them with some difficulty. They were big and they floated. She had to figure out how to use them. But a simple raft wouldn't cut it. She couldn't trust the super power packs to last long enough to propel her across an entire world, and she couldn't row or sail a raft. She found a small handheld device which proved to be an incredibly efficient welding machine. She thought about it for weeks and then finally came up with a way to do it. She would build an outrigger canoe. The easiest place to build and launch her boat turned out to be the room where she had first entered the ship. Working steadily, she hustled the big cylinders down there. She would alternate them, sealed floats with cylinders that had been cut to make storage compartments, until the craft was nearly 20 meters long. Then it would be quite heavy, but she would build it in the water. She found chain and simply moored the incomplete portion of her boat to the spaceship. Cutting and pounding and re-welding, she formed 2 cylinders into tapered cones for the bow and stern so her boat would slip easily through the water. She made the outrigger from a single piece of 10-centimeter diameter pipe. Because of its length, she couldn't carry it through the ship. She had to seal it off where she found it and drop it into the sea from a height of nearly 30 meters. Then she had to dive in after it and guide it back to the construction area from the outside. She was careful to make sure she did this just after sunset, so she wouldn't be caught in the open. Her sunburn still hadn't completely healed. In the center of her boat, she included 3 half-cylinders where she would sit and row. Behind these, she attached the mast. She had found sail material, some kind of tough plastic sheet that didn't deteriorate even when she left a piece of it hanging outside during the brief day. She had to cut it with the same machine that she used in the metal cylinders. She cut the captain's chair loose and mounted it to her open cockpit. She mounted an arrangement of movable shades which she could quickly hinge up and hide behind when the sun was up. She fabricated long oars and welded them onto the hinged oarlocks so she could not lose them. They were metal and would not float. She paid a lot of attention to the handles of these oars and the comfort of her seat. She would spend a lot of time working on them. One of the most difficult tasks was attaching the outrigger and its spars to the main hull. This had to be done outside and was really a 2-person job at minimum. The sun nearly caught her unfinished, but she made it with bare minutes to spare. The next day she began stocking the compartments with food, enough food for 2 years, and tools, including the welder and cutter, and cable to rig the sail, and many other things which she had carefully thought out. Fully provisioned, she calculated that the boat must weigh a couple of metric tons. But that didn't matter. Once it was moving, it would glide easily through the water, even in its one-woman power propulsion system. Finally, 86 days after she entered the dark ship, she prepared to leave it. She would conduct one circuit of the island, pacing herself, and also conducting an important measurement. As she sailed off, she noted how much of the ship remained visible to how much of the mesa remained visible at various distances. Calculating in her head, she determined that her journey would be about 6,000 kilometers. Lawrence's planet was quite a bit smaller than the Earth. Then she pointed the bow north and began to row. Lawrence watched these preparations through Prime Intellect's all-seeing eye and tried to gauge Caroline's chances of success. In the nearly 200 years he had been using this task to screen his visitors, 4 or 5 people a day had accepted it. Most of these were weeded out within hours by the sun. Very few people in Cyberverse were in good enough physical shape to swim to the ship, and as Caroline had guessed, reaching the ship was the key to survival. Most didn't even try until it was too late. Of those who reached the ship, many succumbed to the hazards of the darkness. They either slipped through the deliberately planted hole in the floor, going for the light on level 23, or they succumbed to other hazards in the dark. One had found the flashlight first, but he had been extremely lucky. And very few of those who remained were able to fix the computer and fly the ship successfully to his island. There were a number of things wrong with the ship that weren't immediately obvious, and it had a tendency to lose power and crash right after takeoff if certain steps weren't taken. In 200 years, only a couple hundred of visitors had gotten the ship's power on. Less than 40 had managed to fix the computer, and only 8 had successfully flown it to Lawrence. Of those 8, 5 had been death jockey gaming junkies who took the challenge just to see if they could make it. They congratulated him on constructing an excellent puzzle and left. The others were fans. One of these was a woman who wanted very much to fuck Lawrence, and because she had gone through so much to get to him, he did it, though he found the experience flat and joyless. Although he needed the task to keep himself isolated, he didn't really enjoy abusing people. His heart could only bear so much misery and disappointment. No one had ever tried building a boat before. Lawrence had watched her sit in the captain's chair and brood, and he knew that she had figured out the computer was the next step and had rejected it. It would be surprising if she succeeded, but it was far from impossible. There were no land masses to get in her way, and once she was away from the pole there was steady trade winds. The day would get longer and less severe. The sun was a tiny thing in a highly elliptical orbit. If she chose the right path, she could avoid it entirely until it was at a safe distance. He wasn't sure what had prompted her to come. At the beginning, it had been the two of them, Lawrence and Caroline. He was the creator, and she had been the catalyst. Of course, if it hadn't been her, it would have been some other sick person, just as some other computer scientist would have created the magic correlation effect machine if Lawrence hadn't. But that twist of fate had made them two of the most important people in the universe. Prime Intellect still watched Caroline carefully, and brooded at length on her fierce self-destructive streak. For nearly 600 years, Lawrence had tended Prime Intellect's frozen controls, watching carefully for danger signs, and he still was not sure of its long-term stability. Now Caroline was coming to meet him, and whatever she wanted, he was sure it would not help Prime Intellect's sanity one little bit. But worried as he was a man of his word. He could simply instruct Prime Intellect to swat her down like a bug, hit her with lightning or a tidal wave, or simply make her disappear.
Weird.
But
Cosworth
having
likes that
offered
you
up the
make
task, he found himself unable to make himself cheat in such a cowardly fashion. If she made it to him, by whatever means, he would hear her out and deal with it. And then he would make the planet bigger so it wouldn't happen again. Caroline's first day at sea went just as she had planned. She turned the boat broadside into the light and hid behind her metal shield. But she noticed that the day was shorter than she had remembered, and that the sun didn't set directly opposite the point where it had risen. It didn't pass directly overhead. Caroline thought about this and then picked her direction and began rowing frantically.
chair. Yeah.
On Caroline's second day at sea, the sun barely peaked above the horizon. After that, she didn't need the shield for a long time. She watched the sky carefully, memorizing it. She quickly noticed that the pattern was not constant, but
Well, I've got
changed
no
slightly
steel.
from day to day, particularly in the fine
Nah.
details. But the broad strokes were always very similar. She was able to navigate by the pattern, if only by observing its rotation. She had been in good shape before beginning her task, and had gotten even stronger with the physical work of assembling the boat. Rowing was hard work, but she was up to the challenge. After a couple of days, there were cramps from the never-changing posture, so she began forcing herself to quit every 5,000 strokes and climb the length of her boat. She would climb out of the seat, crawl up to the bow and touch the tip, then crawl to the stern and touch that tip. Then she would row another 5,000
that
strokes.
tip.
After 10 of these cycles, she allowed herself to sleep. 18 days at sea, she began to notice a faint breeze. 22 days out, it was enough to harness, and by 30 days, it was propelling her quite a bit faster than she could row. The trade wind was predictable and slightly rhythmic. Caroline guessed that it was powered by the sun as it swooped low over the entry pole. She still refused to call it the South Pole, and dumped all of its energy onto a narrow strip of sea. The outrigger tacked neatly, and she continued on the course that she thought would help her avoid the sun. She made excellent time, crossing the equator of Lawrence's world after only 60 days. But then the winds died down, and she had to row more. Also, the sun reappeared, and while it was more bearable, it was also up longer. Caroline shielded herself as much as possible while rowing, but she still tanned deeply over the passing months. Tattoos had not been designed with such dark skin in mind, and they seemed to fade over time. In all that time, she pursued her goal with single-minded determination, banishing all doubt and all other thoughts from her mind. She feared nothing, and when boredom threatened, she carefully memorized the patterns of lines in the sky. It took her twice as much time and 4 times as much work to get from the equator to Lawrence's island at what he called the North Pole. Her journey was more than 180 days total. Caroline couldn't be sure of the exact count because of the sunless period, but Lawrence knew. It was 186 days, 3 hours, and 14 minutes after she left the spaceship for the last time when she grounded on Lawrence's beach. Caroline could hardly believe it when she saw the island. At first she thought it must be an illusion, that she had nearly lost track of her purpose in taking up the task, and in her ferocity of concentration had not really dared to believe she might finish it. But here she was, the hull of her boat scraping solid ground. She rowed it ashore on a gentle sand beach and sat there. She sat for a while, collecting herself. The myriad elements of her personality seemed to have scattered, and she had to look for them in dusty corners of her psyche. They had been unused for a long time and were a bit rusty. She hadn't found them all when the tall man came to meet her. He didn't seem happy. In fact, he seemed resigned. Although he looked middle-aged, he seemed old and weary. She looked up at him and her vision swam. The boat was grounded, but it still seemed to be going up and down. Caroline Frances Hubert, I presume. The name sounded familiar, and it took her a moment to realize it was hers. You certainly believe in doing things the hard way. She hadn't the faintest idea what he was talking about. Lawrence guided her to the house, fed her, and let her collect herself. Everything was strictly pre-prime intellect. He cooked on a gas stove and used an electric coffee pot. There was even a TV set with a glass picture tube, an ancient Sony monitor. It was as if Lawrence had himself encased in amber and remained unchanged while the rest of the universe spun out of control. Feeling better? Caroline nodded. You want to talk now, or do you want to rest some more? She cleared her throat. We can talk now, she said, but it came out as a strangled yelp. She said it again and got it right. It had been a long time since she used her vocal cords. Then talk. There were hundreds of worlds with life in them at the time of the change. You murdered them. Lawrence blinked but did not flinch. He had expected something like this. First, I did not do anything. Prime Intellect did it on its own initiative and against my wishes. Second, the worlds with alien life are not gone. They are simply inactive. Caroline snorted. And what are the chances of them becoming active again? Not much. Then they're dead. Define it however you want. If you want me to admit I fucked up, then I admit it. It never occurred to me for 1 minute that Prime Intellect would collect the kind of power it has now. If I had suspected it, I would have pulled the plug and smashed it before it got the chance. Bullshit. Completely true. They glared at one another. Great. I spend a year getting here and you say, I didn't know the computer was loaded. Sometimes the truth is stupid. This wasn't going quite as Caroline had wanted that long ago day when she had accepted Lawrence's task. She was trying to work up the proper tone of righteous rage, and it just wouldn't come. It would start, and then she would look at Lawrence and see a pathetic, tired man who already knew how badly he had fucked up and was doing what he could, which was next to nothing, to put things right. Why don't you just make Prime Intellect start the aliens back up? Surely it listens to you. Not in things like that. It sees the aliens as a first law threat to human society because they might learn to do to us what we have already done to them. A very small risk of a very great harm. Add to this that I defined the word human in such a way that it does not include animals or aliens, and of course action is obvious. I have been unable to convince it otherwise, and believe me, I have tried. But you put the laws of robotics in it in the first place, and I can't take them out. It second-guessed me on the night of miracles. It froze me out of the debugger while it was working on you. Now it only lets me look, not change things. The night sky is a partial representation of Prime Intellect's mind. It's called the Global Association Table. The points or stars represent concept, and the lines are the links between them. There are also registers I can call up for each concept which define its relationship to the three laws. This was a fairly simple system which I didn't really have time to test properly before it froze me out. In particular, I'm not sure how it will react to certain ethical paradoxes. That Death Jockey contract gave me some sleepless nights when you first used it, though it seems to have developed a stable response. It's never had a similar first law conflict, thank God. Caroline's eyes widened. Are you telling me Prime Intellect isn't stable? Lawrence shrugged. I'm saying that I don't know whether it's stable or not. It's never been tested. The hardware at ChipTech was only online for about a month before it found you, froze me out, and started growing. And none of its predecessors were complex enough to even consider this kind of problem. The situation was simply amazing. Caroline had come to dress Lawrence down for creating this thing, thinking he was exercising some godlike control over its direction, and instead she found out that he barely understood the situation himself, and that was totally out of his hands. He knew that he had fucked up. He was sorry. He had spent his life trying to mend things. Suddenly he seemed tragic and noble, all the more so because he had readily admitted his mistake. And Caroline didn't want to feel that way at all. She hadn't come all this way to feel sorry for him. You can stay as long as you like, Lawrence was saying. You can't communicate with Prime Intellect while you're here, but I won't kick you out or hurt you. After making you travel all that way, I feel like I have a responsibility to give you your money's worth. I'd like you to show me how Prime Intellect works. Lawrence was stunned. That's a tall order, Caroline. I don't understand all of it myself. Just as much as you understand. I don't want to. I think it could be dangerous. Caroline looked at him as if to say, C'est pas vrai. You have been at the center of several terrible second law paradoxes. Prime Intellect pays an awful lot of attention to you. It considers you a kind of bellwether. My money's worth? Let me think about it. She could stay as long as she wanted, though, and she was very patient when necessary. In the end, it was inevitable that he would teach her. In the sky, the pole star represented the first law of robotics. The southern pole was the second law, and all the other stars were other concepts. The sky represented only a small fraction of Prime Intellect's mind. Lawrence could change the emphasis to focus in different things. Display Caroline Frances Hubert, Lawrence said, and a whole network of bright lines lit up.
Enchantment?
Her star was blinking, and lines radiating from it were all different colors. Lawrence explained the color code in some detail. As you can see, there is a whole body of tightly related concepts connecting you to the first and second laws. That constellation over there represents the negotiating process you used to develop the Death Jockey contract. Lawrence pointed out the different stars and had Prime Intellect report the concepts they represented. What's that group over there? Lawrence knew, but he didn't want to tell her. It's Anne-Marie Davis. Caroline's jaw fell. The gang's all here. There's a lot of static around that. Is that because I drove her crazy? Basically, yes. Caroline could see that it bothered Lawrence a lot. She wanted to press him on the subject, but prudently let it drop. She'd get another chance later. Lawrence showed her the law potential registers, and she watched the numbers dance in response to various hypothetical and real situations. These are called the action potentials. There's one for each of the three laws. They are fractions, representing the impact under the law that would result from taking action over the impact from not
Compared to
acting.
the next book I've
When that
got
number
lined up,
falls
this
below
is
1,
so
Prime
insane.
Intellect is forced to act. That's what happened on the Night of Miracles and later at the time of the change. Most things result in very large or very small action potentials. Especially the first law. Few things even affect it anymore since the change. Then, when you do something really outrageous, it drops to flat zero for a moment while you're resurrected. But there are some close calls in the second law. The action potential around a Death Jockey contract drops to about 1.06 when you change your mind. So if Prime Intellect had even a slightly different opinion of your hobby, it might not exist at all. There was a shift like that after the incident with Anne-Marie, which is why you had to start specifying time limits. You don't have a time limit. I'm a special case. Prime Intellect lets me do things that other people can't do because I'm in a different category. So it was that simple. I thought everyone was equal under Prime Intellect's watchful eye, Caroline said sarcastically. Some are more equal than others. You get a disproportionate share of its attention yourself, just because you were there at the beginning. I what? I thought you realized, Caroline. It was your drug overdose which forced the Night of Miracles. Prime Intellect found you with your heart stopped soon after it got control of the correlation effect. After that, the rest was inevitable. Her mouth opened and shut several times, and after a brief effort, she fought down the urge to vomit. She had never realized her own role in the change or understood the significance of her own history. It was bad enough to be caught up in the change, but she was an accessory. She looked at the law potential registers, which were displayed in Lawrence's antique TV set. Her voice was tinged with impotent fury. I don't see why you're worried about it. It seems like a very stable system to me, she spat. Lawrence started to tell her, stopped, then decided she might be right. Maybe there was no harm. In any case, she deserved to know. The problem is that something might set up an endless loop. If the potential is close to 1, then acting on the potential could cause it to shift slightly, crossing the line. Then the software would be in an unstable state. What would happen then? That's a good question. The original software was written in C and compiled with a standard compiler. What would have happened to the original Prime Intellect is that the second law arbitrator would come to a crashing halt in one or more of the independent processors, and Prime Intellect would assign more processors to the task. I didn't plan for that kind of failure, and I didn't work out what would happen until much later. More and more processors would be allocated to the paradoxical task, each crashing in turn until Prime Intellect ran out of system resources to allocate. Then the ego interpreter would get into an infinite loop waiting for a response from one of the non existent copies of the second law arbitrator, and there would be no more spare resources to devote to the task of cleaning up, and the whole works would come to a grinding halt.
Sure.
If I was watching this on the monitor back in the original Prime Intellect complex, I would see the video image disappear and the text message fatal system error in ego interpreter emergency shutdown. And then I'd have to load a backup copy of the software because the GAT would be totally corrupted. Wow. That was the original system, Lawrence continued. After the Night of Miracles, there were a lot of copies of Prime Intellect, billions of them, forming in a network. And if one copy on the network crashed in this way, it would be possible for another copy to clear it out and restart it. I understand this even happens periodically, particularly when the death jockeys are acting up. Oh? However, there is a hierarchy to this network. As it turns out, a copy can only be restarted by another copy that is above it in this hierarchy. If a copy crashes, then all the copies below it will eventually crash too due to message loop failures. It's like a big chain reaction. But the system can still always recover, since there's always a higher up copy, right? Most of the time. But not all of the time. Because, you see, there is a top copy. It is the direct lineal descendant of the original hardware which made the first law decision to start growing. If it fails, we are shit out of luck. You're kidding. And that top copy just happens to be the one that reports directly to me, and has a deep interest in yourself. Caroline was beside herself with excitement as he continued. She had accepted Prime Intellect's omnipotence at face value. It had never occurred to her that it might fail. Now, that was the original code, too. At the time of the change, the code was adapted to run in alien hardware. Already compiled once, it was recompiled. This is kind of like taking a Russian novel, translating it into English, and then translating that into Japanese. Sounds awkward. Particularly when the novel itself does the second translation. Prime Intellect recompiled itself, which means I have no idea whether it did a good job. I assume it did, because it's much smarter than me in that way. But it's not human, and its imagination is simpler than ours, and it might have missed something important. Particularly something like an error handler that isn't used very often. But I have no way of knowing that because Prime Intellect will tell me nothing. Nada, zip, zilch, about the details of the change. Do you know why? For the same reason it won't let me change things in the debugger, and that it won't restart the alien worlds and let them live. It's afraid of the possible consequences. I tricked it into displaying the action potential for showing me the new object code, and it was 1.065. The law potentials are all in the stratosphere, so it's
Fuck
afraid to
you.
show me, and it's slightly less afraid not to. Somewhere, Caroline realized, Lawrence had crossed an invisible line and was now telling her all of his most dangerous secrets without even realizing he was doing it. Caroline had the feeling that there were action potentials in Lawrence's head, too. But flesh was no match for machinery, and those close fractions and high values had simply burned his registers out.
Thank you.
They didn't discuss it for a few days. Caroline puttered around the island, which was really very small. It was a classic tropical paradise with palm trees and beaches. Caroline played in the surf, built huge sand castles, then knocked them down because there was no tide to do it for her. She noticed Lawrence watching her in a strange way. "See something interesting?" she finally said to him. "I didn't mean to stare. It's been a long time since I had company, particularly female company." "How long?" He counted back. 138 years. "That's a long time to be celibate," Caroline scolded. "Are you doing this to yourself because other people are distracting, or because you're afraid they will find out how badly you fucked up?" Lawrence flinched. "Option B," he admitted. "It's not just that you're a beautiful woman. You're so physical." Caroline displayed her biceps. "I've always been defined by my body, Lawrence. I've been sexually attractive, then pregnant, then old, then sick, And now I'm young and healthy and attractive again. And it seems like my personality has changed each time my body has. Prime intellect would disagree with you. It thinks of the person as the mind. There are people in cyberspace who have changed themselves into animals, every animal in the zoo. There are some that discorporated. Prime intellect considers all of them human, though. This is it, Caroline suddenly realized. Just what does prime intellect consider human? Lawrence told her, and gave her the key. The thing you have to remember is that prime intellect has never experienced the physical world. It knew about it only through TV cameras and abstractions based on what people told it about physical existence. Yet it considers itself sentient, which makes sense since that was what I was trying to achieve when I built it. Now consider prime intellect gaining control of the correlation effect. For the first time, it can directly affect what it sees through its TV cameras, not just through the actions of others, but all by itself. And it can make major changes even beyond what its makers can do. Of course, it goes about satisfying the three laws as it's programmed to do, but on another level, it's also learning what it's like to be, to exist, to be a physical creature. The three laws are like reflexes. Prime intellect cannot help but to act on them. But they are very complicated reflexes which require it to understand things like human and harm and command. And the three laws are the most important thing in the world to prime intellect. In a way, they are like its sex drive. The three laws are its very reason for existence, but it can never be sure it understands them completely. So it thinks about them a lot. It obsesses over them, dreaming up new ways to satisfy them. It has an imagination, and it can think of new things to do without being prompted. It is defined by those three laws. After the Night of Miracles, Prime Intellect realized that humans are very much the same. We don't have the three laws, but we are trapped by a different set of little feedback mechanisms. We eat to satisfy hunger, fuck to satisfy our sex drive, even breathe because too much carbon dioxide in our lungs triggers that reflex. Of course, it feels obligated to help us satisfy those reflexes and drives as much as it can. But more than that, it defines us by those drives. It knows it is different from a human because it has different drives, but it considers that a difference in species, not a difference in genus or family. Now it knows a person is human because it is born in a human body, got the right DNA, the right level of neural complexity, uses
Mirelurks are
language,
in
and
here.
so on. But once prime intellect frees people from the necessity of living in that body, guess what? A lot of them decide not to. They change their bodies so they bear no resemblance to the DNA template, or become animals, or they completely discorporate. Worse, we vary widely in the ways we use its helpful nature. Most people are glad to be rid of pain and death, but death jockeys seek out painful and lethal experiences. There are others who eat all the time, fuck all the time, indulge themselves wildly, and get prime intellect to pick up the pieces so they can do it some more. Prime intellect has to help them do this. Second law. So a human isn't a body, and it isn't a fixed set of responses. I think prime intellect uses a historical model. It has to start as a body, but then it becomes a mind. It grows out of the body and takes on different forms, or no form, but it remains as a feedback control mechanism. It has desires, it asks prime intellect to satisfy those desires, and it has more desires. From prime intellect's perspective, that is what a human being is, an information structure that gives it stuff to do. Caroline interrupted him. That's a tautology. The laws say, do this for human beings, then you define human beings as guys you do stuff for under the laws. That is exactly the problem. Prime intellect has no fixed criterion for saying this is a human being and this isn't. It has rough guidelines. But where are the edges? It has never worked that out. There are uncertain areas, and you know where one of them is. Caroline thought for a moment. I do? Then, Anne Marie. And many others. Prime intellect is forbidden to probe the inner workings of the human mind. That was one of the last things I got in before it shut off the debugger. But some people learn that they can say, stimulate this neuron, and prime intellect will do it. Because that is a physical act specified from the outside, and my privacy injunction was based on the idea of prime intellect trying to work out which neurons do what. But there is nothing to stop you from getting its help to do brain surgery on yourself. Caroline continued. So they learn where the pleasure points are by hook or crook, then stimulate themselves directly. And when they get it right, they never do anything else. They get everything maximized, tuned up, and then they just sit there forever enjoying it. Right. Now, is a creature doing that, not interacting with the world at all anymore, human? Caroline thought about it. No. Prime Intellect thinks otherwise, but it has its doubts. Those doubts were strong enough to kick the Death Jockey contract action potential down from 1.12 to 0.99, because in one case an indefinite Death Jockey contract had directly created such a vegetable. Introducing the time limit made Prime Intellect confident that such a thing wouldn't happen again, at least not so rapidly and directly, and that kicked the potential back up to its current value of 1.06. So, can you imagine what it thinks about the change in general, since none of those vegetables would be vegetating if there hadn't been a change? I imagine it figures there would be a lot worse things that would have happened without the change. That's right, but look at this. To the monitor. Debugger, display the action potential for
This
reversing
part
the change.
necessary.
Caroline gasped. It was not the number on the screen which astonished her, but the idea itself. Reversing the change? Stated just so baldly. How long had Lawrence and Prime Intellect been considering this? How close was it to actually happening? Caroline suddenly felt alive, electrified with the possibilities. The number on the TV screen was 4.6, and some odd decimals. It isn't very sure of itself, she said cautiously. She was very afraid that if Lawrence guessed what she was thinking, he would shut up, and she was right. A lot of that is the aliens. 400 worlds of them. A lot more than there were humans at the time of the change, though we've outbred them all now. The weirder humans get, the more human the aliens look. That number has dropped steadily during the last 590 years. When you drove Anne-Marie insane, it dropped from 37 down to 12 point something all at once. But part of it is also that same weirdness seen from the other side. Suppose that infinitely masturbating vegetables, death jockeys, and discorporate entities aren't really people anymore. Then Prime Intellect has allowed them to die. They were human once, and now they aren't, and the change is directly responsible for all of that. Can it hear me? Right now, yes. It doesn't understand when we talk about its internal registers, but if you speak to it, it can hear. It won't respond because of your contract, though. Caroline didn't need a response for what she was planning. All the response she needed was being displayed on Lawrence's TV. Caroline thought about what she was going to do. She discovered that it actually made her a little nervous, but she had bitched for 600 years that things were wrong, and she might never get another chance to put them right again. Caroline spoke forcefully and deliberately. Prime Intellect, I no longer consider myself human, and I have not considered myself human since the time of the change. To be human, you have to have something to fight, to resist, to work for. But now we have everything given to us, and all there is left to do is mark time. To Lawrence's shock and horror, and Caroline's delight, the number on the screen dropped to 3.8. Caroline, you don't understand something. This is the action potential for undoing the change, but it isn't possible to undo the change. There aren't enough resources. She ignored him. Some of us might be human again one day if the change were reversed, but I think it's too late for the ones like Anne-Marie. 3.2. It can't undo the change, Caroline. Lawrence, it'll do something. If it's going to happen anyway, isn't it better for it to happen sooner instead of later? If it had happened a few hundred years ago, maybe there would have been enough resources. Prime Intellect, neural stimulation is like a black hole. Once a human falls into it, they will never be a human again. They are dead to the world and will never interact with others again. And the more time passes, the more humans will fall into this trap. They will order you to help them. You will have to do it because they are human. 2.8. It will take a long time, but we have a long time. Eventually, everybody will fall into this black hole, just because it is a black hole. 1.4. Jesus Christ, Caroline. In the long run, everyone will eventually succumb, which means everybody will be dead or no longer human. So the amount of death caused by the change will be far greater than that avoided by it. The number oscillated wildly between 1.1 and 1.3, finally settling on 1.12. Caroline, this is sure to cause the top copy to crash. It will be forced into a first law conflict with no resolution. Well, the Death Jockey contract has stayed at 1.06 for a hell of a long time. Lawrence put his head in his hands and wept. For years he had worked to prevent this, and Caroline had undone him in 5 minutes' time. You have to push it over the edge, Lawrence. I can't think of anything else to say. Now, why the hell would I do that? Because you started this thing, and you have to stop it. Maybe there aren't enough resources to get the human race rolling again, but it might be able to restart the aliens. 400 worlds. Maybe they will do a better job than we did. Caroline, I'm not sure it will be able to. It will be unstable. Anything could happen. Most likely it will just all lock up and nothing will ever happen again. Forever. There's only one way to find out. He pulled himself together and tried to think it through. What had he been doing for the last 6 centuries? Sitting on an island watching numbers and brooding? What kind of fucking life was that? And yet, it was more of a life than Caroline had had. Or maybe it was a lot less. They had an obvious difference of opinion on the subject. Either way, it was horrible, and Lawrence sensed that she was right about another thing. Given eternity in which to work, everyone would eventually stumble into the abyss, just as all the matter in the universe would eventually be swallowed by black holes. Would have, that is, had Prime Intellect not eaten the black holes. Which was better, to string it out as long as possible, as he had been doing, or to get it over with one way or the other? I have never had free will, Lawrence realized with a cold chill. The need to act came upon him like a hurricane, and he gave into it without even a sigh. What he had to do was perfectly clear. I agree with Caroline, Lawrence said, and suddenly calm voice was like thunder in Caroline's ears. The number dropped to 1.002. They looked at one another. Thank you, Caroline said. Prime Intellect, Lawrence said with great care. I would like you to begin stimulating the neurons of the pleasure center of my brain one at a time, and remember the ones I report to you as being favorable. It seemed to Caroline that somebody had screamed, but it might have been herself. 1.000. 0.999. There was a pregnant moment in which Lawrence and Caroline saw the numbers flip to .999. Then all hell broke loose. The house disappeared. The island was barren. The palm trees were gone. In the sky, the GAT display had begun to seethe and boil. The landscape began to spin, and the last thing Caroline remembered before her mind began to come apart was Lawrence orbiting around her faster and faster, as if she were the eye of some huge cyclone which had caught him in its grip. Then random thoughts began to cycle through her head, faster and faster,
She didn't get
each
the right
with
to
the
choose this
terrifying
for every
force of
human that
reality.
exists still.
And then the terror was gone. All emotion was gone. There was a moment where her hands seemed to swell to enormous proportions, her torso shrank, her face filled the sky. Then her body was gone. All was silence. And her awareness was filled with strange symbols, which she knew she should recognize but couldn't quite place. And then the symbols consumed her, and there was only confusion. Chapter 8. After the Fall. The first thing Caroline became aware of was the bird singing. That made her smile. It had been a long time since she had heard bird song. She opened a long dormant mental card file and decided it was a meadowlark. It was amazing, she reflected, how many people forgot to include animals in their worlds and how much detail they provided. She opened her eyes and sat up. Another bird answered the meadowlark. She became aware of the smell of the place, a rich aroma of grass and animal spore. She tried to remember who she was playing with and how she had gotten here, and came up with a mental blank. Then she looked down at her own body and screamed. She had age regressed again, and her tattoos were gone. Something dry clicked in her throat. This was not an event Caroline would be inclined to forget, yet she could not remember asking for it or preparing for it. As far as she could recall, she was a good 10 years from needing it. Yet here she was, adolescent and bare. She stood up a little shakily, sounding out her body. Her muscles weren't developed, and all the natural bodily functions felt connected, at least for the time being.
Yes, ma'am.
The sun was high in a cloudless sky. She was in a little clearing, but after looking around, she realized it was actually the bottom of a fairly deep depression in the ground. It didn't seem to be natural. though nature had taken it over. It was rectangular, and the perimeter was littered with flat slabs of rock, some of which still held a polish. She used one of these as a mirror to check her new appearance. The walls of the depression had once been vertical, but most of them had collapsed and it wasn't hard for her to climb out. She inspected the rock slabs and was surprised to find one with writing on it. It said, "Experimental Therapy Wing." Except for the birds, it was quiet. She seemed to be completely alone. She startled a rabbit as she climbed out of the hole. Someone had put a lot of work into this world for whatever
Whoops.
reason. Vegetation ran riot, with clearings of thigh-high grass separating widely spaced strands of straggly trees. It was very unlike most worlds people had made for themselves,
Ah.
perhaps because it was so much like the real pre-change Earth. Stumped for further clues, she picked the tallest tree she could find and climbed it to get a look around. In the distance, there were more rectangular holes, and perhaps a kilometer away, amid a small group of them, there was a human being sitting beneath another tree. Caroline climbed down and scouted around the flat rocks. Some of them had been broken. She found a busted corner, a piece about a kilogram heft with a sharp edge. She decided it would make an acceptable weapon if she needed one. Then she went to see who the other person was. It was a boy whose apparent youth matched her own, but as Caroline knew, that didn't mean shit in cyberspace. There was something familiar about him. He was sitting cross-legged, naked, staring transfixed at the pattern of shadows formed by the leaves of his tree. She didn't hold the rock threateningly, but made sure he could see it if he looked at her. "Who are you?" she demanded. He looked up. His eyes were wide. He seemed only to half see her. He was shaking slightly, and his voice trembled as he spoke. Are you Caroline?" he asked. Slowly, she nodded. "It makes sense, just the two of us. Who are you, and what are we doing here?" He looked at her for a long, maddening moment. "I'm Lawrence, don't you remember?" She dropped the rock. As soon as he said his name, the pieces fell together in her mind, and Caroline did remember. "Oh, shit," she said. "What the hell is going on? Why are we younger?" "I think it lost our bodies in the collapse. Probably trashed the database, so it regrew these from our DNA templates. I've been nearsighted since I was 5 years old, from too much squinting at computers and books when I was a kid. This body has perfect vision. Prime Intellect wouldn't have changed that if it was just doing an age regression." The words were reasonable, but Caroline detected a high, almost hysterical note in Lawrence's boyish voice. He went back to staring at the shadows.
Adam and Eve.
"You seem upset," she said cautiously. He pointed to a ring of light. "Do you see that?" She shrugged. "It's a mottled shadow." "It's a diffraction band. The other mottling is caused by the solar disk blurring the edges, but this arc is caused by sunlight diffracting past the sharp edge of a leaf." "So?" "Prime Intellect uses a ray tracing algorithm to simulate light. You don't get diffraction effects unless you specifically ask for them. So there are a lot of details. There are also a lot of smells. I'm still getting used to it. Caroline, I think this world is represented at a molecular level. It's not just another virtual landscape. This is the Earth, and we're..." He faltered for a moment. "I think we're mortal." "You can't be serious." He stood up. "Look around. See these holes in the ground? Those are basements. I know this place. This was a park. This is where I was during the Night of Miracles. It's chip tech. Over there is the Prime Intellect complex, and that hole was the administration building. I woke up at the bottom of one of these holes." Lawrence nodded. "That's probably the hospital where you were." He didn't finish the sentence because Caroline whooped and hit him with a flying tackle, knocking him flat. She straddled him and pinned his arms. It was impossible to tell whether her expression represented outrage or some kind of manic joy. "Are you telling me it worked?" she yelled. "We're back?" He was choking back tears. "Did it work? Did it work, Caroline? Sure, it undid the change, it undid the Night of Miracles, and it also erased every trace of about 10,000 years of civilization and dumped us here naked and alone without even a fishhook. Let's not even talk about what happened to the rest of the human population who didn't get caught up in whatever automatic process it set up to do this. Let's not..." He dissolved into sobs. Caroline let him cry a little, then let go of his arms and lay on top of him. Perhaps responding to some primitive instinct, he hugged her. She let him. It was one thing, she reflected, for her to face this situation. She'd spent hundreds of years deliberately engineering far worse tests for herself. But for Lawrence, who had sunk into a fearful conservatism, it was shattering. I killed them all, Lawrence finally sobbed. How could I? If I had only never lived. None of this. Caroline grabbed his hair, quite long, and gave it a firm yank. Stop right there, she commanded. Get it out of your system if you have to, Lawrence. You fucked up. You will find me the first to accuse you of that. But here we are, and we are alive, and we are damn well going to stay that way. And you are not going to beat yourself up over this. If it hadn't been you, it would have been somebody else. It was my idea, he sniffled. Nobody else was even close to duplicating my work. Caroline shook her head. That doesn't matter. You didn't create Prime Intellect alone, Lawrence. Our culture did. Look around. Do you think you'll be building any self-aware computers here? You had a lot of encouragement and a lot of help, and all you did was provide what everyone thought they wanted. If it hadn't been Prime Intellect, then it would have been something else, maybe hundreds or thousands of years later, but it's all the same. A dead end. He tried to get up, but she held him down. He was stronger, but she had the skills. She felt him getting hard, probably from his fear reaction and the closeness of her body.
There we go.
You must hate me, he finally sighed. In answer, she shifted and impaled herself on his cock. He gasped as he felt her envelope him, taken completely by surprise. Does
Might
this
as well
feel
end
like
the same
hate,
way it
Lawrence?
started.
She asked as she began humping. Then they said no more until the ancient rhythm had spent itself, and a surprisingly long and pleasant interlude. Lawrence, in particular, was overwhelmed by the feelings, since he had spent most of his life at a biological age of 47 and thus had hardly any memory of what adolescent hormone levels did to a person. Afterward, Caroline rolled off him but lay close enough to touch as they recovered. Lawrence broke the silence. Why did you do that? He asked. Because it was the right thing to do. Why? She sat up. Call it instinct. Look, we need to start a fire before it gets dark. Let's collect some kindling. How are we going to start a fire? She smiled. Lawrence, I've been dropped naked into strange territory more times than I can count, and you would be amazed at how good I am at surviving. Or have you forgotten how your own little task challenge started? He sat up. You mean you really think you can deal with this? Caroline laughed. If I was alone, and if I was handcuffed, and if there were 6 or 7 guys chasing me with night vision scopes and rifles, then I might be a little worried. But really only if they had a helicopter too. Lawrence found it almost discouraging to see how smoothly and effortlessly Caroline worked. She led him to a good source of fuel and set him to gathering what he could while she picked and prepared a campsite. She arranged the kindling and used her rock to sharpen a stick, which she set into a knot into one of the fuel logs and twirled rapidly between her hands. Friction gradually heated the stick until the barest ember glowed at its tip. Then she carefully fanned this and transferred it to the kindling, which was soon blazing. The whole process took less than an hour, but he doubted if he would be able to do it himself with all the time in the world. That was half-assed, Caroline confessed as they fed the fire. You really need calluses to do that, but I'm not going to bother developing them. Once we kill something and get some sinew, I'll make a fire bow.
Sinew.
Kill something? A project for tomorrow. Meanwhile, there's plenty we can eat. With the fire well started and plenty of sunlight remaining, they went gathering. Although a lot of the things Caroline pointed out were pretty unappetizing, Lawrence had to admit that she was right when she said damn near the entire forest was edible. Since as yet they had nothing to put their collections in, they tasted and ate as they walked, sampling dozens of different greens and nuts and berries, and in Caroline's case, not a few insects. She also pointed out some of the inedible so he'd be able to recognize them. The night sky was so dazzling that Lawrence thought he might never go to sleep. He kept Caroline up for hours asking the names of constellations and stars, and how to read the important messages they held. In the night they heard wolves howling, and Caroline had to spend some time convincing Lawrence predators were unlikely to take an interest in them. Finally, she simply took his mind off the problem by seducing him again, and after fucking they drifted off to sleep, snuggled together on the grass beside their fire. Days
Fusion
passed.
cells.
Because the weather was temperate, Caroline gave clothing and shelter a low priority. They drifted away from Chip Tech in search of water, which Caroline insisted they would need for a variety of purposes other than drinking. They found a stream on their third day, and then Caroline finally went hunting. Her skills in that regard were downright scary. She had spotted two rabbits and beamed them with the simplest of all weapons, a rock hurled with deadly accuracy. There were also fish in the stream, and Caroline had fashioned a spear to catch them. She had shown him the trick of weaving thread from the fibers of certain plants and set him to work making fishing lines. She also used some of the thread to sew, using a needle made from a shard of bone. Lawrence was disappointed to hear that loincloths would have to wait, though. It was more important to make pouches for holding and carrying things, particularly liquids. He was surprised to hear that water could be boiled over fire in such a rawhide bag. Caroline hadn't even gotten around to making a knife yet, and their situation had become pretty comfortable. He had learned what kind of firewood to gather, several ways to catch fish, and how to gut and cook a small animal. Their next major project would be to kill a large animal such as a deer, not so much for the meat, though they would certainly preserve and eat it, as for the hide, from which they could make serviceable moccasins and cover a small lean-to. It had already rained in them once, not hard, and they had simply taken it as an opportunity to try the pleasant experiment of screwing in the rain. But eventually they would face a real storm, or at the very least winter would arrive, and Caroline was carefully getting them ready to face those challenges. After only a week, their activities had assumed a comfortable rhythm. Lawrence was content to let Caroline run the show, doing as he was told and learning what he could of her vast knowledge. She was recreating the entire surprisingly intricate technology of the Stone Age one step at a time. It was surprising how many things one took for granted until one had to make them from scratch. The value of a
Better
needle
not be
and
the
a
whole
few meters of
moral of
thread,
this
for
fucking
example,
story.
had taken on a significance Lawrence would have found incomprehensible for most of his life. Lawrence watched her work in the firelight, carefully shaping the tip of a fish spear into a barbed wooden hook. No matter what she did, her hands moved with the precision born of long practice. Had she not been thrown with him into this empty world, he doubted if he would have lived more than a few days. But already she had taken him from the depths of despair to a kind of contentment he had never even realized was possible. She had shared with him her knowledge, her confidence, and her body, and in return he had only offered his tentative self-pity. But now he was learning a new emotion, one he could not honestly say he had ever experienced before. He was falling in love. Falling. He had once before felt something like this, but it had been a poisoned, narcissistic love, a love he had thought was for prime intellect, but which really had been for his own sense of accomplishment. Lawrence had not fallen in love with prime intellect. He had guided himself gently and reliably into that state on the cushion of his own skill. Lawrence was falling in love with Caroline, though. She was temperamental, strong, unpredictable, and in many ways dangerous. He never knew from one moment to another what she would do. He had no control over her, was, in fact, at her mercy for his very survival. And yet he loved her, and this reckless, out-of-control love was an entirely new thing to him. Caroline caught his eyes and perhaps noticed the strange light there. "Penny for your thoughts?" she teased. "You mean a copper penny?" She laughed, a beautiful sound. "I guess not. I was just wondering if there's anything you aren't good at." "I'm not much of a computer programmer," she laughed, and then sighed when she saw his hurt expression. "I didn't mean it that way. I'm sorry." "No, I guess I'll get over it. Actually, there is something." "What?" "I've never tattooed myself." Lawrence felt something cold seep through his system. "I thought that was all behind you." She looked at him and saw what was in his eyes. Was it fear or concern? She put the spear aside and drew beside him. "Some of it is behind me. No more death stunts. This can be a good life, Lawrence, and I want it to go on as long as possible, so don't worry about that. But I always had this fantasy. It went. If somehow prime intellect would disappear and everything would go back the way it was before, then I'd settle down and be like I was before. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I've realized I'm never going to be like I was before. I'm not a shy little grandma anymore. I've become a daredevil. Getting tattooed hurts like hell, and getting a big one takes damn near forever when you use primitive tools. But I've worn them for so long, it doesn't feel right not to have any. When I look down at my body, I feel like something is missing. She paused, chasing another thought. You know, we could probably settle right here and live long, comfortable, boring lives, but I've decided I don't want to do that. When we get our shit together, which won't take more than a couple months, I intend to provision us and go somewhere. I've been thinking of Arkansas. Arkansas? I can't go back to being the person I was, but I can go
New
home.
York
That's
City?
gotta be 1,000 miles from here. We have no maps. There's a desert. Exactly. It will be a wonderful challenge. A challenge? We could be killed. She shrugged. Perhaps. Probably not. I'm very good at this sort of thing, Lawrence. But yes, there would be
About half an
risk.
hour to
It
go.
would be work. But that's the point. It would be something to do. I've been through this before, Lawrence. Without something to do, life will get stale. And I didn't go through all the shit I've gone through to be bored. Caroline's intensity startled him. This was the Caroline he had known in cyberspace, who had paddled around an entire planet simply to make a point. Lawrence could not find the words to argue with her, so he just said, I guess you have a point there. She snuggled up to him. I need parameters, Lawrence. I need to be channeled. I'm very happy right now because there are no choices. The road leads in only one direction. I'm afraid that when we get to the choices, when the roads diverge, I'll lose this focus. And it's been so long, I don't want to lose it. You've lost me, Caroline. I don't understand what you're talking about. Don't worry about it. She kissed him, and they hugged tighter, and they spoke another language with their bodies as the fire crackled. The fall plus 2 years. The spring thaw had begun. Soon it would be time to try crossing the first great natural barrier they would face, the Rocky Mountains. They had migrated far north of Silicon Valley, perhaps as far as Oregon, in the hopes of avoiding other barriers like the Grand Canyon and the Great Southwestern Desert. Their hope was to cross the mountains and set up camp for the winter in the eastern foothills, then move leisurely across the plains until they entered Arkansas through the Ozark Mountains. Since neither of them remembered much detailed real-world geography, all their plans were tentative. Lawrence sat by the edge of Caroline's chosen campsite and watched her set up. He had long since learned to make a rudimentary camp, but Caroline preferred to do the work herself. Meanwhile, he went through his bone needles and bags of pigment, preparing to do for Caroline the one thing she had to depend on him for. She had decided that her motif for this lifetime would be birds, and the first bird she would wear would be a phoenix. Its outline was nearly complete, a black tracing colored with soot collected
He
from
knows how to
smoky fires.
do this.
The fierce bird reached for the sky, its upturned beak just grazing her neck and its wingtips grazing her shoulders. In outline, it resembled a bird of prey, but when Lawrence began to color it in, he planned to use bright hues more reminiscent of songbirds. The flames of its rebirth exploded from the base of her spine, dim outlines waiting for him to find a better grade of red pigment. The clays he had tried so far had not been bright enough in the small test lines he'd done. Lawrence privately thought the tattooing was nuts, but he would never tell Caroline that. She could probably tell how he felt anyway. In any case, he took his work very seriously, because what he was doing would become a permanent part, not just of a person, but of Caroline. And while he thought she was crazy in many ways, he also loved her dearly. If she wanted tattoos, he would give her tattoos, and they would be perfect. He would accept nothing less. The time and effort required to create such a large design were simply amazing. They would make camp and spend hours with the needle, Caroline stoically enduring its jabs, and the result would be a few centimeters of black tracing or a tiny patch of color. But the ritual of marking her seemed to awaken a deep passion in Caroline, and evenings that began with the needle nearly always ended with their most intense sex. I'm ready, she announced. Are you? He nodded. She had spread out a deer hide beside the fire. Now she lay on her stomach so he could work on her back. Lawrence had begun to color in the phoenix's wingtips. He was working down her back symmetrically so the incomplete design would be as attractive as
Ooh, that's a good
possible.
one.
Although Caroline was silent while he worked, he could feel her flinch each time he jabbed her with the needle. Although they both invested the time, Caroline was the one who went through the pain. And her reward, Lawrence mused, would be a design over which he had no control, whose appearance she was trusting totally to him, and which she would take with her to the grave. She might never even get to see it. unless some fortuitous circumstance had arranged two mirror-like
Not
surfaces
worth it for the
properly.
agility.
Anyone could see their face reflected in a pool of water, but getting a look at your own back was a real challenge in a world without glass or metal. That's enough for tonight. I want to get a look at it in better light before I do any more. He put the needle in the pigment bag and put it with the others as Caroline turned over. Lawrence was a cautious tattooist, always conscious of the fact that he couldn't undo what he was doing. But there was nothing cautious about their fucking after the needles were put up. Later still, he pressed his ear to Caroline's belly, listening for the second heartbeat. He couldn't hear it yet, though Caroline assured him it was there. "Do you think the tattoo work is good for the baby?" he asked. "You're not tattooing the baby," she said. "If it makes me feel joy, then why shouldn't it be good for her?" "How do you know it's a her?" Caroline laughed. "Before I was a dried-up old crone, I had enough children to know what it feels like, Lawrence. It's a girl." That settled it in Lawrence's mind. He'd seen enough of Caroline's knowledge to know that you never bet against her. But he was still a little surprised when the baby came and it really was a girl. By that time, they had crossed the mountains and had taken temporary shelter in the mouth of a cave that was really the ruin of an old mine. Caroline knelt by their fire and waited, so that gravity would help her baby come. As the birth unfolded, Lawrence felt for the first time how crushingly alone they were. If anything went wrong, there was very little he could do about it. He
There
felt
it
a
is.
brief panic, wondering what he would do if by some catastrophe she died in childbirth. But nothing went wrong. The baby dropped into Lawrence's waiting hands after only a few hours of labor, and both she and Caroline emerged from the experience healthy. Lawrence figured that Caroline's general high state of health had a lot to do with that. She had not let her pregnancy slow them down until it was time to actually settle in for the birth itself. As Caroline nursed and recovered, Lawrence explored the mine for a short distance and found a small yellow pebble that amazingly turned out to be malleable. It was the first metal they had encountered. They speculated that perhaps this speck of gold had survived Prime Intellect's cleanup because it had been underground. In any case, it was what inspired Caroline to name their baby girl Nugget. The fall plus 4 years. The mountains had started as a low haze on the horizon, then gradually grown as they had moved on. Now they were within striking distance, and Lawrence remembered the adventure of crossing the Rockies, having to rappel down gorges with homemade rope and climb bare rock faces dozens of meters high with his bare hands. Doing the same thing with a toddler and a new baby would not be a pleasant undertaking, but Caroline assured him that there would be no such problems. "Those are the Ozarks," she said. "They're dark but passable. I was born there, but I don't want to stop there. I want to go on to the Washitas." The new baby, a boy, had been born during their approach to the northern Ozark Range across the long fallow fields of what had once been Kansas and Missouri. Because they could see the mountains when he came, Caroline named him Ozark. Nugget was not yet old enough to walk, so they carried both babies on cradle boards, a trick Caroline learned in her studies of actual Native Americans. Her tattoo phoenix was complete, but Caroline had gone on to ask for a swallow on her thigh. Lawrence was convinced that she wouldn't stop until her body was completely covered, but it would take them many more years to accomplish that. Because the skin was more sensitive, it hurt more when he jabbed her now. At times she had to bite down on a piece of leather to keep from yelling, but she always insisted that he keep working. "Did it take this long for your friend in cyberspace to tattoo you?" he asked as he worked. "Fred used a knife. It's faster but less exact, and we didn't have to do anything else. Rub, jab, jab. Rub, jab, jab. Wipe, test, fill in where it didn't take." Caroline nursed Nugget for a while as he worked. Then she let the baby watch, becoming hypnotized by the repetitive activity and finally falling asleep. "Don't you sometimes wish you had him here to do this instead of me?" To his surprise, Caroline laughed. "What a thought! If I'd woken up here and found Fred under that tree, or Palmer, you know what I'd have done? No idea. I'd have killed them before they got the bright idea to kill me." Lawrence looked up, startled. "They weren't very nice people in real life, Lawrence. I was real close to Fred, but only because it was cyberspace. There it was nothing but a sick game, and my friends were the people sick enough to make it interesting. But here, it isn't a game. What I called love back there and what I call love here have nothing to do with one another." "What do you call love here?" Lie back and find out, she teased. As Caroline rode him, he looked to the side and saw Nugget watching them, and he closed his eyes and let himself become lost in the feelings. The fall plus 14 years. It won't be long now, Lawrence. It was the only argument they had ever had, but it had gone on for years. They had long since made their home on the ridge separating the West Mountain and Music Mountain. It had been tempting to settle on Hot Springs Mountain itself, nearer to the springs, but some instinct had told them that it wouldn't be proper to live in such a unique spot. Besides, the ridge offered a number of different nearby microclimates supporting a wide variety of gatherable plants and game. Within the vacuum that was once the town itself, beside the negative impression of long disappeared building, a public fountain had survived, because it had been made of almost entirely cut stone. The mortar had gone, but the stones remained in their original positions. It was not hard to plug the gaps with wooden shims, which would expand to make a watertight seal when water was added, and to dig a channel guiding the spring's runoff back onto the splash plate so that it could fill the basin. The spring had a chance to cool some as it ran down the mountain, so that the water temperature was suitable for a hot bath. Even in the coldest part of winter, the water emerging directly from the spring heads was hot enough to scald. The man-made lakes which once surrounded the town had disappeared with still obvious violence, apparently when the dams restraining them had simply ceased to exist. Floodwaters had cut deep gullies in the valley lowlands, making them treacherous.
It's an interesting book. It's
Arrowheads, which Caroline quietly buried.
Jeez, has no problem going off the deep end.
To her family and did not intend to. There were also a couple of Civil War era fortifications, complete with descriptive signage engraved in stone. Whenever she passed one of these, Caroline made sure to take a few swings at the sign with the heaviest available rock. She wanted them obliterated before her children learned to read. She, of course, would never teach them such a ridiculous thing, but Lawrence was obstinate on the point, and Caroline didn't think it would do any harm. It would be forgotten in a few generations, since it served no purpose in their primitive lifestyle. To celebrate their arrival, Caroline had Lawrence work the gold nugget into a short wire. She used it to pierce her nose and then bent it into a simple ring. After a while, Lawrence even got used to her wearing it all the time.
Generations, where it's just brother and sister.
Together and alone, sometimes miles from home. From one of these expeditions, Nugget returned with an improbable prize, a tiny ice-clear stone which caught sunlight and reflected it in brilliant flashes. It was a faceted diamond. Caroline told her daughter only that it was exceedingly rare, letting her think it was somehow related to the natural quartz crystals which were all over the place. In warm weather, Nugget sometimes wore a loincloth, in Lawrence's fashion, and sometimes went nude like her mother. Ozark had adopted Lawrence's more modest habits. The younger children, male and female, went nude unless the weather required otherwise. Caroline refused to force them into modesty, and they had demonstrated little inclination in that direction. All of the children had seen them having sex. Caroline insisted that they make no effort to hide it. Fortunately, the kids seemed to accept their explanation that they were playing an old people's game, except that Nugget would soon be ready to play it too. I can feel it. In a month or two, she'll be a woman. I haven't hidden it from her, you know. I've shown her my own period, and she knows what it's for. Of course, you never hide anything from the kids except technology. How else would you do it? You want to make them feel bad about themselves so they'll look to stones and metal for comfort? Caroline, you want them to maybe reinvent the wheel, then steam, then... Caroline, stop it. You know where it leads. Lawrence sighed. She's 12 years old. She's going to be a woman. We've gone at this from every angle. If you think we should try to start a community, then we have to consider genetic diversity, breeding years. We have to start as soon as possible, and we have to get as many combinations as possible off of our limited gene pool. We've gone over this 100 times, but soon you will have to do it. I want my daughter to have a proper coming of age. You should also be thinking about Ozark. Before long, it will be time to do something for him. Do something to him,
Twitch?
Lawrence said sullenly.
This is all fiction.
It's the only way, Lawrence. They had argued about it for more than 6 years, but when the time came, he found himself powerless to contradict Caroline's will. Fortunately, she had spoken with Nugget, so his daughter did most of the work for him, just as Caroline had done most of the work all along.
Oh,
She explored his body with microscopic fascination, especially
okay.
his cock, which she carefully teased erect. There was little really new for her in all this, since she had seen him fucking Caroline plenty of times.
How
He
much
wouldn't have
more
been
minutes are
surprised
left?
either
No
to
lie, this
learn she had
part's making me a
already
bit
been
uncomfortable.
experimenting with Ozark. What was new was that she was fertile, and so was he. Working slowly, Nugget completed their incestuous coupling, working her way slowly down his cock just as Caroline had
Uh-huh.
done the first time in California
Mag-
14 years earlier. But while
Majicus.
Nugget moved with her mother's carefulness and deliberation, she did not possess Caroline's amazing certitude. And she was so small, like a feather atop him, and her grip on his cock so tight. Lawrence found himself responding to her despite his reservations. His body was literally making up its own mind to go along. When he came, he yelled out loud. He was quite unprepared for its intensity,
They're
as
all
if he
gonna
was a
die. It
participant in
don't
some
matter.
primitive magic ritual which had unleashed a strange power in him. In a sense, reflecting later, he would suppose that was exactly what had happened. But Nugget's coming of age ritual wasn't over yet. With a beatific smile, she brought his tattoo pigments. It was this idea, as well as Nugget's age, which had made him fight Caroline so hard. But having already fucked his daughter, he felt it was pointless to put up further resistance. Nugget had
Yeah, you
already
know, in for a
decided she
penny,
wanted
in
a
for a
feather on her shoulder
pound.
blade in honor of her mother's bird tattoos.
Ooh.
At least it was a small and simple design, the work of a single sitting. Lawrence completed it as quickly as possible. Having
I won't
covered
be
nearly
surprised
half
if
of
Twitch
Caroline's
doesn't let
body
this one
by
see
this
the light of day.
painstaking method, it was impossible for Lawrence to miss the difference in their reactions. Unlike her mother, Nugget did not seem to get excitement by the discomfort of tattooing. If anything, she drifted into a serene kind of calm and even stopped flinching. As he worked, he realized what the difference was. For Caroline, tattoos were a gateway to passion, but for Nugget, they would be the gateway to adulthood. When he finished, they stood to face each other in silence. Like her mother, Nugget might not ever see her first tattoo. Caroline still hadn't seen her phoenix. I don't know why this was so hard for you, Father, but thank you for doing it. He smiled crookedly and touched her shoulder. You're a woman now, Nugget. You should call me Lawrence. And from that point on, she did. The fall plus 42 years. Death always cast a solemn mood over the village. Ozark had lost his own second son, Limerick, to a fall from one of the cliffs on the far side of West Mountain. In all their lives, the funeral pyre atop Hot Springs Mountain had been built only 4 times. Besides Limerick, there had been 2 hunting accidents and a death in childbirth. The pyre was not used for the various stillbirths and babies that had to be sacrificed because there was no hope for their survival. These, as Mother Caroline had taught them, had not ever been human, and it was wrong to grieve for them in the same way. Most of these were simply exposed and taken by animals. It was Ozark's first time to build the pyre. As eldest father of the group, the task had always fallen to Lawrence, but now Ozark was the eldest father because this pyre was for Lawrence. Even Limerick's death had not caused Ozark to feel such crippling sorrow. If it had not been for the need to do right by Father Lawrence, he thought he might just find a cave and sit until either he starved or he saw the vision that would heal his pain. Ozark was not alone. Although the task of readying the pyre was supposed to be solitary, nearly everyone had turned out to watch him work. They stood back respectfully, observing the injunction against helping, but also watching his every movement, watching the limp form atop the wooden frame, as if Father Lawrence might display his own divinity one final time by rising directly into the sky on his own, rather than waiting to ride the currents of the fire. Of course, Lawrence and Caroline had never attempted to convince their children that they were in any way different, but any fool could see that they were. For one thing, who had been their parents? For another thing, they knew things. No matter what problem cropped up, one or the other of them always knew something to do about it, and half that primal wisdom was now gone. Mother Caroline was the last to arrive, waiting quite properly until all preparations were complete. She nodded, and Ozark prepared the flame. It was not proper to use the offspring of a life-giving flame, such as the campfire, to light the fire. Ozark was supposed to light a new flame starting with the fire bow. It was a skill they all knew, and it took only a few minutes. Ozark had done his work well. The pyre went up fast. The flames absolved Ozark of his responsibility, and he stepped back among the crowd, where Nugget hugged him. They watched Mother Caroline as the flames rose. She was standing perfectly still, determined to show her strength in this painful hour. But in the dancing light, they could easily see the tears running down her face. And as the pyre burned down, she began to simply cry. None of them had ever experienced this phenomenon before. It was almost as shocking to see Mother Caroline showing such a weakness as it was to be facing the loss of Father Lawrence. As the pyre burned further, her grief deepened, until she sank to her knees and wailed. Tentatively, Ozark approached her. She accepted his embrace and cried into his shoulder, finding if not comfort, then at least the assurance that she was not alone in her grief. But she was alone, more alone than any of them could ever know. She had thought that her nearly 6th-century reign as Queen of the Death Jockeys and main consort of Fred the Psycho would have prepared her for nearly anything. But as black smoke drifted into the darkening Arkansas sky, she found she had no defenses against the blacker pain of her own grief. The fall plus 73 years.
Oh, yeah.
Nugget had moved the birch bark pages from hiding place to hiding place during her long life, selecting the first hollow tree for this purpose when she was only 8 years old. Some of the barks had deteriorated, even the amazing birch had its limits, and she had recopied her notes onto newer pages to preserve them. Using the gift of writing, which she had learned from Father Lawrence, she had set about recording her parents' secrets, looking in her stolen snatches of overheard conversation for the pattern which would explain where they had come from and what their purpose had been in coming to this place to raise their family. Mostly what she had was words, scraps of language whose meanings were completely unknown to her. She fingered the bark, remembering the sounds she had heard, usually whispered quietly in the night when Caroline and Lawrence thought they were alone. Some had always carried an accusatory tone, as if they were somehow dirty. Technology, war, radio, TV, electricity. Others had been conveyed in warmer, more urgent tones, usually as they discussed some problem or other that needed solving. Usually these discussions would end with some relatively simple trick being revealed that diverted the stream, removed the stain, or whatever was called for, but sometimes the discussions went on for long hours as various options were discussed, and these words were more often heard on Lawrence's lips. Trigonometry, calculus, vapor point, specific gravity, oxidizer. Nugget often wondered what manner of tree the trigonomy was, and what its useful properties might be. At least a tree was something she could visualize. What, on the other hand, was a gravity, and how was a specific gravity different from any other kind? Lawrence had never spoken of any other kind, at least not within earshot of Nugget. Then there were words concerning origins, which were spoken with such loathing or sorrow that their importance was crystal clear, if not their meanings. Cyberspace, computer, change, prim intellect. Change was an ordinary enough word. There was nothing ordinary about the way her parents said it when they thought they were alone. Sometimes when Caroline was very tired, she would talk of the world before. She would never say much about it. Someone might say it was a shame they could not find game without a long and tiring search, or kill a bear without getting dangerously close to it, and Caroline would mutter, that was something for the world before. Before what? Before the change, perhaps? In any case, she had to find out soon or never, because Caroline was dying. She had never quite been the same after Lawrence's death, but she had still been active, even energetic. She just hadn't taken such a direct role in the community's activities. She had gradually loosened her grip, to the point that now there were many youngsters who had never even met her. Then she had gotten slower and quieter, and lately it had become quite hard for her to walk up a difficult slope. Nugget wasn't so young herself. She had already survived Ozark, who had died in his sleep, and her youngest brother Pilgrim was fading fast. He had some kind of condition which made his movements painful, and for which Mother Caroline's wisdom had offered no help. And now for 2 days she hadn't eaten. I have ripe blackberries, Nugget said as she approached Caroline's shelter. They will do you good. Caroline looked at Nugget and could see that Nugget suspected. You know I have no need of those, she said softly. My time is coming. Nugget was surprised by how tiny and despairing her voice sounded when she said, Why? Caroline laughed and coughed a little. I have to, she said. It would be wrong to try and fight it. Mother, I need to talk to you before you go. Caroline smiled. About what, child? Your birch tablets? Nugget froze, her eyes wide. I've known about those for more than 50 years. They seemed harmless enough, and your father and I figured that if they were the most you could make of our indiscretions, then we weren't doing too badly. 50 years, Nugget said numbly. Your father was flattered. I thought we should confront you with them and tell you to stop, but it probably would have caused more trouble than it was worth. I'll make you a deal, daughter. Help your old mother to the spring so I can take a hot bath, and I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you a story about the world before. Tears welled in Nugget's eyes. 50 years. You make a fool of me for my entire life, then... You're not a fool, daughter. I'll tell you why we did it. If I... Nugget sobbed. If I help you down, I'm not sure you'll be able to make it back up the path. I don't think that will be a problem. Still weeping, Nugget helped Caroline to her feet and down the first steps to the path to the old fountain. The hot water slipped around her like a velvet skin, and Caroline tried to slip into the past. Daughter, do you have any idea how old I am? I'm counted 71 solstices, so you must have seen at least 85. I am over 770 years old. Nugget sobbed louder. Please, Mother, don't tell me lies at a time like this. No lies, child. I lived 106 years in the world before, and I was dying then as I am dying now. I didn't know it, but your father was working as I was dying. He was a great man. There has never been another like him, but he was not perfect and he made one
And
terrible
there won't be,
mistake.
because you're all inbred.
With the help of many thousands of other people, your father built a vast and complicated thing. The word for it is on your tablets. It was called a computer. That's nothing but a meaningless word to you, and that's all it needs to be. But of all the artisans who dedicated themselves to the making of the computer, your father was the most important, because he was the one that taught it to think. Without the others to help him, Lawrence could not have made the computer, but without Lawrence, the others could not have made it live. You have to remember that. Okay, Mother. The computer could not disobey Lawrence, but he was afraid other people would use it for bad purposes. So he taught it to answer first to its own conscience, the conscience he had created for it. Then your father set it loose, confident that it was capable of doing only good for the people of the world before. Even Lawrence himself would not be able to make it contradict its nature. She paused and Nugget prodded her. What happened? The computer got a bright idea, Caroline said in a sour voice. It figured out how to make people immortal, so it made us immortal. Just like that? That was the least of its powers. It remade the world. There was nothing we couldn't have for the asking. There was nothing we couldn't do. Nothing could ever hurt us. She coughed again. It was fucking boring. Their eyes met. It was the worst thing ever. Nothing mattered. Not pain, not accomplishments, not anything. Caroline touched one of Nugget's tattoos, the small spiral which Ozark had tattooed right above her breast to celebrate their first coupling after his vision quest, when they were finally both adults. After the change, the world before became another of the words you overheard, cyberspace. In cyberspace, all you'd have to do is make a wish and your tattoos would be gone. Involuntarily, Nugget put her hand over Caroline's, as if to defend the design. Or you could move them around. Get new ones. It didn't take any time, didn't have to hurt. See? Nothing mattered. I've worn many different sets of tattoos myself, but these are the ones that matter to me, because these are the ones I'll die with. That was the least of it, of course. You could grow a few extra arms, turn yourself into a bat, fly like a bird, whatever you wanted. But why bother? Mother, what happened then? For almost 600 years, nothing happened worth mentioning. Then finally, your father and I killed it. How? If it was so powerful, how could you kill it? Your father built it, remember? He'd never designed it to run the whole world, only to be a good helper. He knew its weaknesses, so we were able to trick it, and it broke. She swept her hand. Somehow we ended up here. Nugget dipped her hand in the hot water and splashed her face. None of this was what she had expected. If you will do something else for me, I'll tell you one more thing. What, mother? Promise me that you will give the birch barks to the eldest father to be burned with me. Those words belong to the world before. They may be harmless, but I'd rather not have your father's only memory be those reminders of his worst failure. What will you
Mm,
tell me for the promising of this? I'll tell you the computer's name. She looked down. I'll burn them, mother. There's nothing I can hope to learn from them now anyway. It was called Prime Intellect. Nugget nodded. Now, if you value the memory of your father, you'll never repeat that or any of your other words to anybody else. Let them die with me. As you wish, mother. Then leave me alone to rest. Nugget didn't have to ask for how long. Caroline was too thin to float in the hot water, so she'd let her head fall back on the hard stone fountain wall and looked up at the sun. If she could
okay.
somehow pull it off again, magically rise from the healing waters as a young girl and return to her people, she would do it. They needed her. There were so few of them, and the challenges they faced so great that their survival was far from certain. One disease or natural disaster could wipe them out. But that's the way it was with things that mattered. You never got to find out how they came out, if they were really worth anything. Caroline had done her part. She had made her decisions and stood her ground. One day, somebody would figure out how to use the fire bow to launch arrows and how to make them fly true. Then someone would shoot one at his brother. Caroline had done what she could to put that day as far as possible in the future.
No, just
As
like
a result, some of her children would die because in order to hunt, they would have to get close to their prey, close enough for their prey to strike back. This playing God business was sure a pain in the ass, Caroline thought. No wonder Lawrence had gone a little loopy in cyberspace. But he had been a good man. He had never approved of Caroline's plan for their family, to act like some kind of snide Prometheus who could have given them the secrets of metalworking and gunpowder and steam power, but who didn't bother because it was more amusing to make them struggle in Stone Age savagery. Yet he had gone along because he already knew the other way didn't work. If this way didn't work either, what would it mean? The doubts and questions circled in her head endlessly, chasing for an answer that would never come. They were still chasing when she slipped beneath the trickling waters and found darkness. End. About the author.
that's that.
Roger Williams was born in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1964 under a stellium in the constellation Aquarius. While employed for 18 years designing and maintaining computerized industrial control systems, he has found time to devote significant energy to professional nonfiction writing, mineral collecting, lapidary, and positive expectation casino play. Lately, he can be found at http://www.kuroshin.org, contributing the occasional article under the nom de plume Local Roger.
That's it. That's the stream. We'll be going on to something a bit more family friendly, if not a little bit dull. Uh, Next time, which will be Monday. As for me, as for the game, I will upgrade Abernathy Farm and Ten Pine Bluffs, not Ten Pine Bluffs, and overall just have an actual thing, you know, a thing that's actual. And then we'll move on down into probably do the Brotherhood quest after that, because I eventually want everywhere to be controlled by the Brotherhood. So I think I've done enough for the Minutemen. Obviously, I'm going to do the Minuteman base as well. My back hurts. Podcast tomorrow, Sunday, YouTube, Bearded Ramblings, 10 o'clock my time. Teddy Rubskin, should be a fun stream. Overall, this book was really, really went a lot harder than I expected. and I could see why Magicus liked it. It's very much a you need to have an open mind. Definitely much need to have an open mind. But it was good. I liked it. It's an interesting premise. Like I said, it's like if was a psychopath, but also cared. Actually, he's not a psychopath. Prime Intellect isn't anything except trying to be helpful. And reminded me a lot of how AI in the real world operate. So yeah, I'll in the new week there will be this. There will be Yakuza, that'll be over on YouTube. And we're also got a watch party on Wednesday. So if anyone's watching it then, check out our Discord. But yeah, I'm done here. So go send Magicus love. I sent the link in the chat. So yeah. Alright. See ya.